She was, by every public measure, the most loved woman in Britain. The pastel coats, the matching hats, the pearls, the small gloved wave to crowds who had been waiting hours to see her, the slight forward tilt of the head when she greeted you, as though you in particular were the person she had most been hoping to meet that day. The famous, almost mythologized smile, wide, untroubled, available to everyone from heads of state to the children pressed against the barriers at her 100th birthday parade. She had a gin and Dubonnet before lunch. She loved the horses. She gave away kind words and small jokes the way other public figures gave away signed photographs. The British press called her the Queen Mum. The British public, at her death in 2002, lined up for a mile to pay their respects at her coffin. This is the Queen Mother that the country knew. The Queen Mother her staff knew was a different woman, not entirely different. The charm was real. The kindness, when she chose to extend it, was real. The interest in the people around her, when the people around her had not yet done anything to displease her, was genuine and warm and one of her gifts. But the staff understood something the public did not. They understood that the warmth was something she controlled, that she could turn it on and she could turn it off, and the difference between being inside her warmth and being outside it was as absolute as anything in their working lives. They understood also that once you were outside it, you did not come back. This was the part of her that did not appear in the obituaries, the part the official biographer William Shawcross, in his 900-page authorized account, was careful not to dwell on, the part that lived in the private memories of the courtiers and the ladies-in-waiting and the household members who had served her for decades and who knew, with the precision that comes only from sustained close observation, exactly how she handled the people who failed her. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to, she did not confront, she did not, in any setting that anyone outside her immediate circle ever witnessed, lose her composure. What she did instead was something more patient and more thorough. She decided that you were finished in her regard, and the decision was final. And then, across whatever years of life remained to either of you, she enforced the decision with a perfect, unbreakable, perfectly composed cheerfulness that the people on the receiving end of it found harder to bear than anything she could have said. There was a former governess who lived for 38 years in a house 200 yards from the road to Balmoral, and watched the royal cars drive past her front door every summer of those 38 years, and was never once visited or acknowledged. There was a sister-in-law who lived in exile in France for half a century, and wrote letters that were never answered, and was kept by every available institutional means from being granted the title that should have been hers. There were two nieces, the daughters of her own brother, committed to a mental hospital in 1941 and recorded as dead in 1963 while still alive. There was a granddaughter-in-law who came to her for help and was given none, and who described her by the end as the chief leper in the leper colony. These were not strangers. These were, in every case, people who had been close to her, close enough to be hurt by what she did, close enough to understand exactly what was being done. And what was being done was always the same thing: a door closing, a name disappearing from the invitation list, a warmth being withdrawn completely and without explanation, in a way that the recipient could feel but could never confront. This is the story of how she did it, the story of who watched her do it, and the story of what the people who served her for decades carried with them out of her household, and could never quite say aloud, and only began to say after she was finally gone. She was born on the 4th of August, 1900. Her father, Claude Bowes Lyon, did not register the birth for 6 weeks. He was the heir to the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, a Scottish nobleman of moderate wealth and considerable land, and his 9th child, a daughter, was by his standards not the kind of event that demanded immediate attention to paperwork. The family later paid a small fine for the late registration. The location of the birth itself was never properly recorded. To this day, biographers disagree about whether she was born at the family's London townhouse or at St. Paul's Walden Bury, the country house in Hertfordshire where she spent most of her early childhood. Before diving deeper on that, consider subscribing our channel and push the bell icon so you get all the updates about our channel. This is not a small detail. The woman who became one of the most documented public figures of the 20th century began her life with a missing record. The first thing the world failed to notice about her was that she had arrived. She would spend the next 101 years making sure that no one ever failed to notice her again. The childhood she had was by every account happy. The Beaulion family was warm in a way that many aristocratic families of the period were not. Her parents loved each other. Her siblings were close. She and her younger brother David, born in 1902, were inseparable from their earliest years. Their mother called them the two Benjamins, after the youngest son of Jacob in the Old Testament, and the nickname captured something accurate about their position in the family. They were the late children, the indulged ones, the ones who had arrived after the household had already been built and could be enjoyed without the pressures that had attended the older siblings. She was the favorite. This is also documented across multiple sources, though the people who knew the family at the time were too well bred to put it quite that bluntly. She had been, in the language of her era, a charming child, pretty, bright, quick with a phrase, generous with the small acts of grace that endeared her to adults. Her mother adored her. Her father, when he noticed his children at all, noticed her with particular pleasure. The household staff, by every recollection that has come down to us, found her delightful. She learned in those early years that being liked was something you could produce, not faked. The charm was real, and she had been born with the temperament to express it naturally. But she also learned, watching the effect she had on the people around her, that the charm could be deployed, that a smile delivered at the right moment could change the weather of a room, that a small remembered detail about someone's life, their dog's name, their mother's illness, the place they came from, could produce in that person a loyalty that more conventional efforts at relationship building could not. She was good at it from the beginning. She got better at it across her lifetime, and by the time she became a public figure in her early 20s, she had developed the skill into something close to an art, a practiced, instinctive, continuously deployed talent for making people feel that she was specifically interested in them in the moment of their encounter, in a way that almost no one else of her position bothered to perform. This was her great gift. It is important to be honest about it, because it would be easy, given the rest of what this documentary will examine, to dismiss the gift as performance and to suggest that the charm was a mask over something colder beneath. The gift was not a mask. The charm was real. Her interest in people was, on the whole, genuine. Her capacity for warmth, in the moments when she chose to extend it, was one of the things that made her one of the most effective public figures of her century. But the gift was also a tool. She used it deliberately, and the people around her, especially the people who served her, came to understand across long acquaintance that the warmth she extended was warmth she had chosen to extend, and that the choice was hers to make, and that the same warmth could be withdrawn whenever she decided that the recipient had failed to deserve it. The childhood at Glamis Castle, the family's Scottish seat, gave her something else as well. It gave her a particular relationship with status. The Strathmore family was old. The castle had been in the family since the 14th century. Glamis was the setting of Macbeth, the place where Duncan was supposed to have been murdered by his ambitious thane, the place tourists came to see because of the play, and where the family lived because they had always lived there. To grow up at Glamis was to grow up understanding, at the level of architecture and furniture and the names of dead ancestors carved on tombs, what it meant to belong to a line. Her sense of her own place in that line was firm, not arrogant exactly. The Beaulions were not the kind of aristocrats who needed to assert their position because the position was secure, but firm. She understood from her earliest years that she was a person of consequence, that her family mattered, that the people who worked at the castle, the maids and the cooks and the gamekeepers, were genuinely her social inferiors in a way that the modern world had not yet quite finished disagreeing with. This understanding, absorbed before she was old enough to question it, would shape everything she did for the next century. She would treat servants well. She would learn their names. She would ask after their children. She would be, by every account, a kind employer, kinder than many of her aristocratic peers, more attentive, more genuinely interested in the lives of the people who worked for her. But she would also, always, be the employer. The relationship was not a relationship of equals. The kindness was a kindness extended downward, and if the recipient ever forgot the direction in which the kindness was flowing, if they ever in some small way behaved as though the warmth she was extending implied any kind of equality between them, the kindness would stop, without warning. without explanation. The smile would remain in place, but the warmth behind it would have been very precisely withdrawn. The First World War touched the family directly. Her brother Fergus was killed at the Battle of Lewes in 1915. He was 26 years old. He had married only the year before. The family received the news at Glamis, which had been converted, like many great houses of the period, into a convalescent hospital for wounded soldiers. Elizabeth was 15. She had been spending her days helping the soldiers who were recovering at the castle, writing letters home for them, reading to them, charming them in the way she charmed everyone, providing the kind of cheerful presence that wounded men far from home most needed. She continued doing it after Fergus's death. The family did not collapse. The war did not stop. The work continued, and she continued with it, and by the time the war ended in 1918 she had developed, through the practical experience of being relentlessly cheerful at the bedsides of dying men, the particular kind of composure that would become one of her defining adult qualities. The composure was real. She had been trained in it, by circumstance and by inclination, across the formative years of her adolescence. She knew how to keep going. She knew how to put on the face that the situation required, regardless of what was happening beneath the face. She had learned, in the corridors of a castle that was simultaneously her family home and a hospital, that the public version of you was the version that mattered, and that the private version was something you could manage in your own time, when no one was watching. She was not damaged by this. The composure did not, as it does in some people, harden into coldness. She remained, by every available account, a warm person, capable of laughter, capable of tenderness, capable of the small, spontaneous kindnesses that had always come naturally to her. But she had developed, alongside the warmth, a steel underneath. The steel was not visible most of the time. The smile covered it, the graceful manner covered it, the deployed charm covered it, but it was there. Anyone who lived with her for long enough learned to recognize when it had been activated. The steel did not come out as anger. She did not have, by any account, the kind of temper that her son-in-law Prince Philip would later display. She did not shout. She did not, in any setting that produced a witness, lose her control. The steel came out as something quieter, as a decision, as a closed door, as the particular quality of warm cheerfulness that her household understood to mean, this person, for reasons I will not be discussing, has been removed from the list. She was 23 years old when she married Prince Albert, Duke of York, the second son of King George V. The marriage took place on the 26th of April 1923 at Westminster Abbey. She had refused his proposals twice before accepting on the third attempt. The biographers have all noted this. She had not, by her own later admission, been certain that she wanted the life that royal marriage would impose on her. She had been raised to enjoy a particular kind of upper-class English freedom, the country houses, the horses, the friends, the unstructured pleasure of a life that consequence had not yet caught up with. Royal life would mean schedules. Royal life would mean ceremonies. Royal life would mean, most importantly, that she would no longer be free to choose where the warmth she extended would be directed. She accepted in the end. The reasons for her acceptance have never been entirely clear, even to people who knew her well. Some have suggested she had grown fond of Bertie, as the Duke of York was known to his family. Some have suggested she understood that a royal marriage was, in practical terms, the most consequential thing a woman of her position could do. Some have suggested more cynically that she had calculated the odds and decided that being a duchess was probably better than being merely Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, regardless of how she felt about Bertie personally. Whatever the reasons, she said yes. The wedding took place. The honeymoon was conducted. The young couple settled into the public role that had been arranged for them, the second-rank royal couple, performing the secondary duties, supporting from a distance the much more visible activities of Bertie's older brother Edward, the Prince of Wales, who was the heir and who was, at that moment in 1923, the most photographed and most popular member of the royal family. She had, in marrying Bertie, accepted the role of Duchess of York. She had not in any way, she anticipated, accepted the role of future queen. That role belonged to whomever Edward eventually married. She would be the wife of the brother, the supporting figure, the pleasant, competent, well-liked secondary royal whose function was to do the work the heir did not have time to do, and to do it gracefully, and to keep her own personality contained within the limits that her secondary position required. This was the bargain she had agreed to. For 13 years between 1923 and 1936, this was the bargain she lived under. She performed the secondary duties. She had 2 daughters, Elizabeth in 1926, Margaret in 1930. She built in the small territory available to her as Duchess of York the kind of life she could enjoy. She was charming to the public. She was loyal to her husband. She maintained, with the discipline she had developed in her wartime adolescence, the perfect external composure that her position required. And then, in 1936, the bargain was broken. Edward, having become king in January of that year on the death of George V, decided in December that he could not continue as king unless he was permitted to marry an American woman named Wallis Simpson. He was told that he could not be permitted. He chose to abdicate. The throne passed, in the space of a few weeks, from the eldest son of George V to the second son. Bertie, who had not been raised to be king, who had a stammer that would make his official duties an ordeal, who had been content to occupy the secondary role for which his temperament was suited, became King George VI, and his wife, the smiling girl from Glamis, the Duchess of York, the secondary royal who had been free to deploy her charm as she chose, became queen. She had not asked for this. She had not wanted it. She had, in the small private circle of people who knew her well enough to be told what she actually thought, made her feelings about what had happened clear. She blamed her brother-in-law. She blamed the woman he had insisted on marrying. She blamed with a cold and under-deviating intensity that the rest of her life would not in any way diminish the people who had forced upon her and her husband the roles that they had not wanted and had not been prepared for. The grudge that she formed in December 1936 lasted for 66 years. It outlived her brother-in-law, who died in 1972. It outlived her sister-in-law Wallis, who died in 1986. It outlived in its institutional consequences even the people who had been the original objects of it. The grudge became, across the decades, one of the longest sustained personal hatreds in the documented history of the British monarchy, and it was conducted, throughout, with the perfect outward composure she had been practicing since 1915, in the corridors of a castle that doubled as a hospital, when she had first learned that the face you presented to the world did not have to match the temperature of what was running underneath it. What that grudge produced, how she expressed it, who she punished for it, what she did to the people who came near her brother-in-law and his wife across the long decades, is the subject we turn to next. Because she had decided in December 1936 that 2 people had taken from her something she could not get back, and she would spend the rest of her life in the small daily ways that her position made available to her, making sure that they paid for it. She did not lose her temper about this. She did not raise her voice. She did not at any point in the 66 years that followed do anything that could be cited as ungracious in front of a witness who could report it. She simply decided, and the decision held, and the people on the receiving end of the decision learned, slowly and across years of small consequences, exactly what kind of woman had decided against them. The abdication crisis lasted, in its acute phase, for 11 days. Edward VIII formally signed the instrument of abdication on the 10th of December 1936. The bill confirming it received royal assent on the 11th. The whole thing, the constitutional rupture that ended one reign and began another, that scattered courtiers and rearranged the line of succession and changed the public lives of half a dozen people permanently, was completed in less than a fortnight. The Duchess of York was, by every account from those who saw her during those 11 days, in something close to a state of shock. She had been ill as it happened. Influenza had kept her in bed for much of November and the early days of December. She received the news of the deepening crisis from her bedroom at 145 Piccadilly, the Yorks' London house, in fragments, telephone calls from Bertie at the palace, visits from senior figures who had come to consult with her husband, the gradually clarifying picture of what was about to happen to her family. Bertie did not want to be king. This was the first thing she understood, and it remained the most important thing. He was 41 years old. He had spent his entire adult life arranging himself around the assumption that the throne would go to his older brother. He had a stammer that made public speaking an ordeal. He had a temperament that was, by his own estimation, unsuited to the central public role of the British monarchy. He had, only weeks earlier, said to his cousin Lord Mountbatten, the same Mountbatten who would later be Prince Philip's uncle, that he had never seen a state paper, that he was not trained for the work, that he was a naval officer who had been allowed to assume he would never have to do this. And now he was going to have to do it, and there was nothing she or anyone else could do to stop the situation that had produced this requirement. She blamed Wallis. She blamed Edward. She blamed with the comprehensive intensity of a woman who had been thrown into something she had not asked for. Every person who had any part in producing the catastrophe that had landed in her family's bedroom. The blame was not entirely fair. Edward had made his own choice, and the choice had been his to make. Wallis, by all available accounts, had not actively pursued the abdication and had, at several points in the crisis, tried to talk her lover out of going through with it. The constitutional structures that had made the abdication necessary, the Church of England's position on divorce, the Prime Minister's calculation of what was politically possible, the network of senior figures who had decided that Mrs. Simpson could not be Queen, were not the work of any one person. But Elizabeth was not interested in distributing the blame fairly. She was interested in identifying the people whose choices had ruined her husband's life, and ruined her own life along with it, and she had identified them, and she would not be revising the identification later. There is a remark she is supposed to have made, possibly more than once, in the months and years after the abdication. The exact wording varies by source. The substance does not. She is reported to have said, to friends who could be trusted with the comment, that the two people who had caused her the most trouble in her life were Wallis Simpson and Hitler. Read that sentence again. The woman who would be remembered as the smiling Queen Mum, the morale of wartime Britain, the woman who had refused to leave London during the Blitz and had said, when Buckingham Palace was bombed, that she could now look the East End in the face. That woman placed her sister-in-law on the same level as the man who had attempted to destroy her country. The remark tells you something. It tells you what kind of grudges she was capable of forming. It tells you what kind of categories she sorted people into once she had decided who they were. And it tells you, perhaps most importantly, that the categories were not subject to revision. Once Wallis had been placed in the Hitler category in 1936, that was where Wallis would remain for the rest of Elizabeth's life, without appeal. Bertie was crowned on the 12th of May, 1937, in Westminster Abbey, on the date that had originally been scheduled for his brother's coronation. The arrangements had been made for Edward. The new king simply stepped into the slot that had been prepared. There was a particular cruelty to this, a cruelty Bertie himself felt acutely. He was being crowned on his brother's day, in his brother's place, having taken his brother's life and made it his own without having asked for any of it. Elizabeth was crowned beside him. She wore the consort's crown. She walked in the procession. She performed, in front of the world's cameras, the role of consort to a king with the same composure she had been performing every other public role since adolescence. Inside, she was furious. The fury did not show on the day. It would not show on any day, ever, in any way that a public observer could record. But the people who knew her well, her ladies-in-waiting, her closest friends, the small circle who had access to the unmasked version of her, understood that something had hardened in her between December 1936 and May 1937. Something that had previously been pliant had become fixed. The new role demanded certain things of her. She accepted the demands with the same external grace she had always brought to her public functions. But the role also demanded that she manage on a continuing basis her relationship with the man who had previously held it. Her brother-in-law was now the Duke of Windsor, a title created for him after the abdication, living in exile because the new king's advisers had decided that his presence in Britain would be politically destabilizing. He was married, as of June 1937, to the woman for whom he had given up the throne. The question of what would be done about Wallis presented itself almost immediately. She was, by virtue of her marriage to a Duke of the British royal family, technically entitled to the style of Royal Highness. The standard practice was that a wife took her husband's rank. Her husband was His Royal Highness the Duke of Windsor. By every ordinary application of royal protocol, she should have been Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Windsor. She was not given the style. The decision to withhold it was made formally by George VI, on the advice of his government and his courtiers. The decision was unprecedented. No previous wife of a British royal duke had been denied the female equivalent of her husband's title. The withholding required the issuing of letters patent specifically excluding her from the style that would otherwise have been hers automatically. The decision was, by every account that has come down to us through the people who were close to it, supported actively and personally by Elizabeth. She wanted Wallis denied the title. She wanted the denial made formal. She wanted, as far as the institutional mechanisms allowed, every available marker of inequality between Wallis and the rest of the family put into place. The historian Lucy Moore has documented this directly in her work on the abdication and its aftermath. Other royal biographers have arrived at the same conclusion through different sources. According to historian Lucy Moore, the Queen Mother was so upset over the circumstances that she stopped Simpson from being given an HRH title, even though she was married to Edward. She hated Simpson, even though she handed her the crown. Tanya Gold, a royal writer, told The Guardian via Express. The phrasing matters. She hated Wallis Simpson, even though she handed her the crown. The handing of the crown was the gift, the hatred was the response. Wallis had, by walking away from Edward, made it possible for Elizabeth to become queen, and Elizabeth had received the gift, and had taken the crown that Wallis had effectively given her, and had decided in the same motion that the giver would be punished for having given it. There is a logic here that is worth pausing on, because it tells you something about how Elizabeth's mind worked. The injury was not that Wallis had taken something from her, the injury was that Wallis had given her something she had not wanted. The crown, in Elizabeth's framework, was the burden Wallis had imposed. The fact that the burden also conferred the highest social position any woman could occupy in the British system did not, in Elizabeth's accounting, change the underlying calculation. She had not wanted the position. She had been forced into it, and the person who had forced her was now going to pay across the rest of her life for having done so. Bertie's reign was by general consent more successful than anyone had expected. He overcame the stammer with the help of the speech therapist Lionel Logg. He grew into the role across the late 1930s. He became, by the time of the Second World War, a steady and respected national figure whose visible presence in London during the bombings, alongside his wife and daughters, provided the kind of moral anchor the country needed. Elizabeth, in her role as Queen Consort, became something close to the most popular member of the royal family. Her gift for the personal touch, deployed across hundreds of public engagements, made her, by the end of the war, a national favourite. She visited the bomb sites. She spoke to the survivors. She produced in countless small encounters with ordinary Britons whose lives had been damaged by the war, the kind of warm, attentive, perfectly judged response that left the people who received it feeling they had been genuinely seen. This was the gift she had been developing since Glamis. The wartime years gave it a national stage, and she used the stage with extraordinary effectiveness. But beneath the public success, the structures of her private life retained the shape they had taken in 1936. The grudge against Wallis and Edward had not softened. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor remained in exile, mostly in France, occasionally visiting Britain on terms that the palace had carefully negotiated to ensure they did not come into contact with the people who could not bring themselves to receive them. The negotiation of these visits was conducted by senior courtiers, with Elizabeth's preferences communicated through the appropriate channels. Wallis was not received at official events. She was not invited to family occasions. The carefully constructed exile was maintained year by year, with the same patient attention to detail that Elizabeth brought to every other long-term project of her life. The exile was not, in any obvious sense, hers to maintain. Constitutionally, it was the king's decision how to handle his brother. After George VI died in 1952, it was the new queen's decision. Elizabeth's role in the sustained ostracism was technically only that of an interested family member whose preferences were taken into account by the people who actually made the decisions. But the people who actually made the decisions all knew what her preferences were, and the preferences were strong. And the people who managed the day-to-day relationship between the British royal family and the exiled Windsors understood that any softening of the exile, any meaningful gesture of reconciliation, any opening that might have allowed Wallis to be received as a member of the family, would produce in Elizabeth a reaction they did not want to provoke. She did not have to threaten anyone. She did not have to issue instructions. The institutional understanding of what would and would not be acceptable to her was sufficient on its own. The courtiers calibrated their decisions accordingly. The exile was maintained. The Duchess of Windsor continued to live in France, without the title that should have been hers, without the family relationship that the rest of the Windsor wives enjoyed, on the wrong side of a door that had been closed in 1936 and that Elizabeth had no intention of allowing to open. Just a thing come into my mind. Tell us in the comments where you are from. Also, if you like this documentary, please consider subscribing. George VI died on the 6th of February 1952. He was 56. His health had been declining for years. The strain of the wartime reign, combined with a heavy smoking habit, had produced lung cancer that had been diagnosed and treated but not cured. His death, when it came, was not entirely unexpected, but it left Elizabeth at the age of 51, a widow with no public role. Her daughter was now queen. Her own position as queen consort had ended with her husband's death. She faced the prospect of becoming, in the language of royal protocol, the Queen Dowager, a position that historically had involved retreating from public life, wearing black, mourning in the manner that Queen Victoria had famously mourned Albert. She did not retreat. She wore black for a year, and then she put it away. She announced, in effect, that she would be continuing her public life on her own terms. The title she chose was Queen Mother, a title that had no formal precedent in modern British practice, and that she essentially invented for herself. The role she carved out was that of a senior royal who would do public engagements, support her daughter's reign, and operate with the kind of independence that her unique position made available to her. She also, in the years immediately after Bertie's death, deepened the grudge against the Windsors. She blamed Edward, specifically, for her husband's early death. The reasoning was direct. Bertie had become king against his will because Edward had abdicated. The strain of the role had killed him, in her view, 15 or 20 years before he should have died. Edward had, in this account, taken her husband from her, not all at once, but slowly, by forcing him into a position that destroyed his health. She did not say this in public. She did not have to. The understanding existed in the small circle of people who knew what she actually felt, that the grudge had been intensified by Bertie's death, and would now be carried forward with the additional weight of her widowhood behind it. Edward had killed Bertie. Wallis had made Edward do it. The two of them, in her accounting, were responsible not just for the unwanted crown but for the death of the man she had loved. When Edward came to England in 1972, dying of throat cancer, the Queen, Elizabeth's daughter, visited him in Paris in the final weeks of his life. The visit was brief, dignified, properly arranged. Elizabeth did not accompany her. When Edward died on the 28th of May 1972, his body was brought to England for burial at Frogmore. Wallis, frail and increasingly unwell, attended the funeral. She stayed at Buckingham Palace as a guest of the Queen. The two women, Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, and Wallis, the Duchess of Windsor, were for a few days in the same building. What passed between them during those days has never been fully reported. The available accounts suggest that the meetings were brief and formally polite, conducted under the institutional pressure of a state funeral that required certain behaviors from everyone involved. Elizabeth was, by every account, gracious. She did not raise her voice. She did not refuse to be in the same room. She performed the duties of a hostess to a sister-in-law she had not seen in decades, but she did not extend warmth. The careful observers who were present at the various meetings reported that the cheerfulness she had perfected across the long decades was, in its application to Wallis, distinctly modulated. The smile was there, the voice was even, the forms were observed. What was not present, what no one who watched the encounter could fail to notice, was any indication that the 36 years of separation had produced any softening in Elizabeth's regard for the woman in front of her. Wallis returned to Paris after the funeral. She lived for another 14 years, increasingly isolated, increasingly unwell, in a house in the Bois de Boulogne that became, by the end, something close to a sealed environment in which she existed without the family she had married into ever quite acknowledging her existence. She died on the 24th of April 1986. She was 89. She had spent the last years of her life in a condition of severe physical and mental decline that her caretakers managed with the mixture of professional discretion and quiet sadness that the situation required. Her funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, the place where Edward had been buried 14 years earlier, where she would now join him in the royal burial ground at Frogmore. The Queen Mother attended. She was 85 years old. She had outlived her sister-in-law by less than the difference in their ages. She had, in the half-century since the abdication, held the grudge with a constancy that the few people who knew about it had come to regard as one of the defining features of her character. She had punished Wallis through every available institutional channel. She had ensured the exile, the withheld title, the social exclusion that had defined Wallis's later decades. And now, at the end, with Wallis dead and unable to receive any further punishment, she went to the funeral. What she felt in the moment of attending has not been recorded. She was too disciplined to display in front of the cameras that covered the event anything that could be interpreted as triumph or as regret. The face she wore was the face she always wore at funerals, composed, gentle, slightly sad in the way that the public expected the Queen Mother to be slightly sad at the deaths of family members she had not particularly liked. The grudge, by attending, had received its final expression. She had been there at the beginning in 1936 when Wallis had ruined her life. She had been there at the end in 1986 when Wallis had been buried in the family vault. The 50 years between those two events had been in the small private architecture of her grievances, the time during which she had ensured that Wallis paid for what she had done. She had paid. In every way that the institutional powers Elizabeth could access had allowed her to be made to pay. The exile, the withheld title, the unanswered letters, the long, polite, perfectly composed refusal to forgive that had outlasted everything Wallis had ever tried to do to undo it. Elizabeth had won. By the metrics she had been keeping since 1936, she had won completely. The throne she had not wanted had become hers. The woman who had given it to her had spent the rest of her life suffering for the gift. The ledger had been kept. The ledger had, by 1986, been closed. In the next part, we look at exactly what the punishment looked like, day by day, across the 50 years of its operation. Because the ostracism of Wallis was not a single decision made in 1936 and then carried out automatically by the system, it was a sustained project, requiring continuous attention expressed through specific incidents and specific decisions across half a century. The people who worked for Elizabeth across those years saw the project up close, and what they saw, and only began to talk about in the years after she finally died in 2002, tells you something about the woman that the public version of her, the smiling Queen Mum with the gin and the racing, was very carefully constructed not to reveal. The mechanics of a long ostracism are not glamorous. They consist mostly of small administrative decisions made repeatedly across years, an invitation that does not get sent, a name that does not appear on a guest list, a letter that arrives at Clarence House and is received by a private secretary, read, filed, and never answered. The drama of these decisions is invisible at the moment they are made. The drama emerges only when you look at 50 years of them accumulated and understand that someone has been making the same decision in slightly different forms for half a century. Elizabeth made those decisions, or rather, she let her household make them, on the basis of preferences she had communicated so clearly that no instructions were ever required. Her household understood what she wanted. The decisions flowed from the understanding. The result, across decades, was the architecture of exile that the Duke and Duchess of Windsor lived inside for the rest of their lives. Begin with the title. The withholding of the HRH from Wallis was in 1937 a fresh institutional decision that required active justification. The standard practice was the opposite. Royal wives received the female form of their husbands' titles automatically, without ceremony or special consideration. To deny Wallis the title required the king to issue letters patent specifically excluding her, a legal instrument drafted by lawyers, signed by George VI on the 27th of May 1937, 3 days before the wedding. The letters patent were not Elizabeth's to issue. The decision was, formally, the king's. But the king, Bertie, had been raised in a household where his wife's preferences carried significant weight, particularly on matters of family relationship. He consulted her. She told him what she thought. What she thought was that Wallis should not be granted any of the markers of equal family standing. The Duke of Windsor, when he received the news of the letters patent, was furious. He had assumed with some justification that his brother's affection for him would survive the abdication and that his wife would be received as family. The letters patent told him otherwise. They told him, in the most formal possible language, that his wife was being singled out for a particular kind of institutional inferiority, and that the singling out had been done deliberately by people who had thought about what they were doing and decided to do it anyway. He spent the rest of his life trying to get the decision reversed. He wrote letters, he raised the question, periodically, with senior figures who had access to the palace. He never succeeded. The letters patent of May 1937 remained operative for the rest of his life, and for the rest of his wife's life after his death. Wallis was never Her Royal Highness. She was the Duchess of Windsor, full stop. The omission of the HRH on every official document and in every formal address was a small daily reminder of where she stood in the family she had married into. This was, from Elizabeth's point of view, the foundation of the architecture. The withheld title established the principle. The principle was that Wallis was inside the family by marriage but not inside the family by status. From this foundation all the other decisions flowed. The exile was the second pillar. The Duke and Duchess settled in France in the late 1930s, after a brief stay in Austria. France remained their primary residence for the rest of the Duke's life. The official position of the palace, supported behind the scenes by Elizabeth's preferences, was that the Duke could visit Britain when occasion required, but that he should not establish himself there in any meaningful sense. The visits were managed carefully. They were short. They were structured to minimize the chances of social contact between the Windsors and the senior members of the British royal family who had decided, with Elizabeth's encouragement, that such contact was best avoided. When the Duke did come to Britain, for funerals, for medical treatment, for occasional family events that could not entirely be avoided, Wallis did not always come with him. The unstated arrangement was that he came alone. He stayed in hotels or with friends. He attended the events that required his presence and then returned to France. The visits were endured by all sides. They were not in any sense occasions for reconciliation. Wallis came to Britain only twice, in 50 years of marriage. Once in 1967 for the unveiling of a memorial plaque for Queen Mary, the Duke's mother. Once in 1972 for the Duke's funeral. The first visit was brief and tightly choreographed. The second was the visit during which she stayed at Buckingham Palace and met the Queen Mother for what amounted to the first time in any meaningful sense. That meeting in 1972 deserves attention. It is one of the few documented moments when the two women were in physical proximity for an extended period. Wallis was 75 years old. She was grieving the husband she had been married to for 35 years. She was staying as a guest in the palace of a woman who had, by Wallis's accurate understanding of the situation, spent decades arranging her exile. The Queen Mother received her with the perfect manner she received everyone with. She did not raise her voice. She did not, in any way that the witnesses present could later report, behave with the kind of overt hostility that her private feelings would have justified. She was gracious. She was polite. She offered the appropriate condolences for the death of a brother-in-law she had not seen in 15 years. What she did not offer was warmth. The witnesses who were present, the courtiers, the staff, the senior members of the household who had been observing Elizabeth's deployment of warmth and its withdrawal for decades, understood the difference. They understood that the manners on display were the manners of someone fulfilling a formal obligation. The warmth that the Queen Mother extended to people she actually liked was not present. The performance was complete. The underlying reality was visible to anyone trained to see it. Wallis returned to France after the funeral. She lived for another 14 years. She wrote periodically to members of the British royal family, letters that have been preserved in various archives, letters of the formal kind that exiled relatives write to family members they hope might still respond. The letters were, on the whole, unanswered. The Queen Mother in particular did not write back. This was the third pillar. The unanswered letters, the pattern of correspondence that flowed in one direction. Wallis would write. The Queen Mother would not reply. Wallis would write again. The Queen Mother would not reply. The pattern repeated itself for 50 years, with small variations, in a way that the people who managed Elizabeth's correspondence understood to be deliberate. There is a particular cruelty to unanswered letters that takes a while to fully register. A single unanswered letter can be attributed to oversight, to busy schedules, to the small administrative failures that occur in any large household. 2 unanswered letters begin to suggest a pattern. 5 or 10 or 20 unanswered letters, written over decades, establish beyond doubt that the silence is deliberate. The recipient has decided not to respond. The sender, in receiving the silence, is being told something specific. They are being told that the relationship that the letters were attempting to maintain does not exist, that there is no relationship, that the writing of letters has been received as a kind of trespass, and the response, the absence of response, is the appropriate institutional reply to a trespasser. Wallis understood eventually what was happening. She did not stop writing entirely, but the letters became fewer and shorter and more formal. By the late 1970s, she had largely accepted that the British royal family was not going to receive her as family, that her 50 years of marriage to the man who had once been their king had not earned her any kind of relationship with them, and that the exile she lived in was permanent. The 4th pillar was the social exclusion. This operated through the network of British aristocratic social life in ways that Elizabeth did not have to direct personally, because the network understood without being told what was expected. The British aristocracy was, in the period between 1937 and the 1970s, a relatively small and well-connected world. The senior figures of that world, the duchesses, the dowagers, the women who ran the great houses and arranged the social calendar of the upper classes, knew each other. They communicated, they coordinated, in the small daily ways that such networks coordinate, their decisions about who was welcome in which circles. The Duchess of Windsor was not welcome. She was not invited to the great houses when she visited Britain. She was not received at the country house weekends that constituted the high social calendar. She was, in the language of the network, not received, a phrase that had specific meaning in the British aristocratic world, and that conveyed without further explanation that the person in question was outside the circle and would not be brought into it. This exclusion was not enforced by any formal mechanism. It was enforced by the collective decisions of dozens of women who all understood, without anyone having to say so directly, that the Queen Mother's preferences on this question were known and were not subject to challenge. To receive the Duchess of Windsor at your country house would have been to position yourself, in the network's terms, against the Queen Mother. Almost no one was willing to position themselves that way, so the Duchess was not received. She remained in France, in the house in the Bois de Boulogne, with the small circle of friends who had not been intimidated by the institutional pressure of her exile. The friends were genuine, some of them were prominent, but they were not the people whose social acceptance would have changed her position in the British aristocracy. The British aristocracy had decided. The decision held. The 5th pillar was the financial. The Duke of Windsor had, on his abdication, retained his personal fortune, the substantial inheritance he had accumulated as Prince of Wales, the income from various royal estates that had been arranged for him before he became king. He was not poor. The exile he lived in was a wealthy exile, but the institutional financial arrangements that supported the British royal family, the civil list, the various subsidies and entitlements that flowed through the palace, were not extended to him in the way they would have been to a senior member of the family in good standing. This was not Elizabeth's doing in any direct sense. The decisions about royal finances were made by the government, in consultation with the palace. But the palace's preferences carried weight, and the palace's preferences on financial matters relating to the Windsors aligned with Elizabeth's preferences on every other matter relating to them. The Duke received less than he would have received. The Duchess received nothing of the institutional support that wives of senior royals would normally have received. The financial architecture of their lives was, like every other aspect, shaped by the assumption that they were not full members of the family. The 6th pillar, and this is the one that the staff who served Elizabeth across the long decades remembered most clearly, was the question of language, how they were referred to, what was said about them in the small private conversations that occurred inside the household, what was permitted to be said and what was not. The Queen Mother did not speak about Wallis often. The subject was, in her household, understood to be closed. Michael Thornton recalled being told by the Queen Mother's private secretary, "There isn't a hope, dear boy, of getting the boss to talk about that. It's the one subject she never discusses with anyone, even with us. Sorry. Entertainment Daily. The phrase "even with us" is doing important work. The private secretary was telling Thornton that even the senior members of the Queen Mother's own household, the people who had served her for decades, who knew her as well as anyone outside the immediate family, were not permitted access to her thoughts on this particular subject. The grudge was hers. She kept it private. She did not share it, even with the people who would have absorbed her sharing without comment or judgment. This is unusual in the context of long royal service. The senior staff of any royal household typically have access to the principal's views on most matters of family relationship. They need that access in order to do their jobs, to manage the small daily decisions about who gets invited to what, who receives a Christmas card, whose birthday is marked. The Queen Mother had, on the subject of Wallis, declined to extend that access. The instructions about how the Windsors were to be handled were communicated through behavior rather than through stated preference. The household read the behavior, understood the preference, and acted accordingly. This level of containment is itself a form of expression. It told the people who worked for her that the subject was in some sense sacred, that the grudge was so important to her, so deeply held, so entwined with her own identity, that even the routine professional discussion of it was something she did not wish to permit. The grudge was not a feature of her life that she was willing to discuss. The grudge, in some structural way, was her life, the organizing principle that had run beneath the public charm since 1936, and that she did not propose to expose to the air by talking about it openly. The architecture I have been describing, the withheld title, the exile, the unanswered letters, the social exclusion, the financial arrangements, the closed subject, all of it operated together, year after year, decade after decade. None of the pillars individually was extraordinary. Each of them, considered in isolation, could be defended as a reasonable institutional response to a complicated family situation. It was their accumulation that produced the effect. And the effect, by the time Wallis died in 1986, was as complete as any sustained ostracism in the documented history of the British royal family. She had spent 50 years on the wrong side of a door that had been closed in 1936. She had been denied the title that was her institutional right. She had been kept out of Britain except for 2 brief visits. She had been refused acceptance by the social network that her marriage should have given her access to. She had written letters that were not answered. She had grown old and grown ill and died in a house in Paris where the family she had married into had ensured she would remain. Elizabeth had done this, not alone, not without the cooperation of the broader institutional system that had its own reasons for maintaining the exile. But in her quiet, persistent, decades-long way, she had been the most consistent force behind the maintenance of the architecture. The other figures who had originally agreed to the arrangement, George VI, the courtiers of the 1930s, the prime ministers who had managed the abdication, were dead by the 1970s. Elizabeth was still alive. The architecture continued because she continued to want it to continue. There is a question worth pausing on before we close this part. Was the punishment fair? The simple answer is that fairness was not what was being calculated. Wallis had not, by any reasonable assessment, deserved 50 years of institutional exile. She had married a man who chose to abdicate. The choice had been his, not hers. She had not pursued the abdication. She had by some accounts tried to prevent it. She had been the woman the king wanted to marry. The institutional consequences of that wanting had fallen on her with disproportionate force, and the disproportion had been sustained year after year by people whose original grievances against her had calcified into something more permanent than any reasonable accounting of her actual conduct could have justified. Elizabeth, by every available indication, did not care about the fairness. The grudge was not subject to fairness. It had been formed in 1936 in a moment when her life had been changed against her will, and the formation of it had not depended on a careful analysis of who had done what. It had depended on the simple, immediate need to identify the people responsible for the catastrophe and to ensure that those people paid. The pain continued on Elizabeth's part for as long as she had any power to make it continue. It did not stop with Wallis's death. It did not stop with the gradual fading of the abdication crisis from the active memory of British public life. It continued in the small daily ways that the Queen Mother's institutional position made available, until her own death in 2002. By that point, the original wound was 66 years old. The people who had inflicted it were long dead. The throne that had been the source of it had been occupied by Elizabeth's daughter for 50 years, and by her grandson, though she did not live to see his accession, was waiting in the wings. But the grudge had survived all of that. The grudge had survived everything. It had outlasted its original objects. It had outlasted the political circumstances that had produced it. It had outlasted by some considerable margin the woman who had carried it. The capacity to maintain a grudge of that scale, with that level of consistency across that span of time, is not a casual psychological feature. It is the work of someone whose architecture of relationship operates differently from how most people's operates. Someone who has decided at a foundational level that certain decisions are final, that once a person has been placed in a particular category, the placement is not subject to revision regardless of subsequent events. Elizabeth was that kind of person. The Wallis grudge was the most prominent example, but it was not the only one. The pattern she had developed, the capacity to close a door completely, and then to keep it closed for the rest of her life with perfect outward composure, would express itself again in other relationships with other people who had crossed her in ways she had decided not to forgive. The most consequential of those other cases, the one that most clearly revealed how she handled people who had been close to her and had then disappointed her, concerned a Scottish governess named Marion Crawford. Crawfie, as the family had called her. The woman who had spent 16 years raising the Queen Mother's daughters, the woman whose subsequent fate at the Queen Mother's hands became one of the most quietly brutal stories of 20th century royal service. Her case is the one we turn to next. She was 22 years old when she arrived at the York's London house at 145 Piccadilly in the spring of 1932 to be interviewed for a position she had not particularly been seeking. Her name was Marian Crawford. She was Scottish, the daughter of a mechanical engineer's clerk from Gateshead in East Ayrshire. She had trained as a teacher at the Moray House Institute in Edinburgh. She had been working with the children of a friend of the Duchess of York, a woman named Lady Rose Leveson Gower. When the Duchess had visited and noticed her, the Duchess of York had liked her immediately. This is not a small detail. Elizabeth had a particular gift for taking the measure of people on first meeting, and the gift had been activated in Marian Crawford's favour within the first few minutes of their encounter. She was offered a position. She accepted. She arrived at 145 Piccadilly to begin work as governess to the Yorks' two young daughters, Princess Elizabeth, then 6 years old, and Princess Margaret, then a year and a half. She would remain in the family's service for 16 years. The girls called her Crawfie. The nickname stuck. She would be Crawfie for the rest of her life, even after she left the royal household, even after the catastrophe that consumed her later years, even after her death in 1988. The nickname survived everything, because the relationship it described had been, for the people who participated in it, real. She loved the children. This needs to be said clearly because the later parts of her story can obscure the simple, foundational fact of the relationship. She loved them with the kind of devoted attention that only a young woman without children of her own, who has been given full responsibility for the daily life of two small girls, can develop. She read to them, she walked them through the parks, she designed their lessons, she took them on the small private excursions she sometimes arranged, to ride the London Underground and to swim at public baths, and to do the kinds of ordinary things that royal children of their generation almost never got to do. The Duchess of York had given her permission for these excursions. Elizabeth understood that her daughters were growing up inside an institution that risked isolating them from the country they would, in the older daughter's case, eventually come to lead. Crawfie was given a degree of latitude that was unusual for a royal governess. She used it. The girls were, partly because of her, less institutionally constricted in their childhood than they might have been. Crawfie also did the harder work. She managed the small daily emergencies, the illnesses, the disagreements between the sisters, the homesickness that occasionally surfaced when the family was away. She filled, in the absence of parents who were often busy with public duties, much of the practical maternal role that the children's mother could not always perform. The Duchess loved her daughters, but the Duchess was the Duchess of York. and then after 1936 she was the Queen, and the demands of those positions meant that the day-to-day raising of her children was conducted, in significant part by the Scottish governess who had moved into their household when they were 6 and 1. Crawfie put her own life on hold for the work. She had in the early 1930s met a man named George Boothlet, a banker from Aberdeen. They were in love. They wanted to marry. The conventional path for a woman of her class and circumstances would have been to leave her position, marry George, set up a household, and begin the family that her age made possible. She did not do this, or rather, she did not do it for 16 years. She remained in the royal service. She postponed the marriage again and again as the various crises and developments of the household required her continued presence. The 1936 abdication, the new responsibilities that came with the family's elevation to the throne, the war, and the children's removal to Windsor for safety, the complicated post-war years during which Princess Elizabeth's courtship with Prince Philip required the kind of careful management that only a long-serving member of the household could provide. Through all of this, George waited. He waited for 16 years. He waited until 1947, when Princess Elizabeth's marriage to Prince Philip finally created the natural break that Crawfie could use to end her royal employment. She married George that year. She was 38. She had given the best years of her young womanhood to the royal family, and she had done so on the explicit understanding, communicated through warmth, through small gestures of appreciation, through the medal she received in 1947, Commander of the Royal Victorian Order for her service, that her devotion was valued. The medal mattered. The CVO is a personal gift of the sovereign, awarded for service to the royal family directly. It is not a ceremonial decoration handed out in batches. Crawfie's CVO was a specific recognition of what she had given. It told her, in the formal language of royal honors, that she was regarded as someone who had earned the family's lasting regard. She left royal service believing that she had a continued relationship with the family she had served for 16 years. The princesses were grown. Her direct daily role with them was over, but the bond she understood would endure. She would still see them. She would still hear from them. She would still, in the small ways that long royal service made possible, remain inside the warmth that the family had been extending to her for the entirety of her adult life. Then she made a mistake. The mistake had several stages, and the people who later assessed her conduct have disagreed about which of the stages was the truly fatal one. The simplest version is that she wrote a book about the princess's childhood. The more complicated version involves the specific circumstances under which the book came to be written, the assurances she believed she had received, and the way the entire project unfolded over the course of about 18 months between 1948 and 1950. In late 1948, Crawfie was approached by an American couple named Bruce and Beatrice Gould, the editors of Ladies' Home Journal, a major American magazine. They wanted her to write articles about her time with the princesses. They were prepared to pay generously. The American public was at that moment hungry for accessible, sympathetic accounts of the British royal family. Crawfie's perspective, warm, intimate, written by someone who had actually been there, would, the Goulds calculated, be of enormous commercial interest. She did not say yes immediately. She was conscious that any public account of the family's private life would be at minimum a delicate matter. She wrote to the Queen, Elizabeth, the new mother of the family, the woman who had hired her 16 years earlier, asking for guidance. What happened next has been the subject of considerable subsequent dispute. Crawfie's later account was that she had received tentative permission to proceed, on the understanding that the articles would be published anonymously. The Queen's account, communicated through her staff after the eventual fallout, was that no such permission had been given. The truth, as far as the documentary record allows it to be reconstructed, is somewhere in between. Crawfie did write to the Queen. The Queen did respond. The response was discouraging but not absolutely prohibitive. The phrasing, characteristic of Elizabeth's communication style, was such that a person desperate to interpret it as approval could find a way to do so, while a person looking for clear permission would have understood that permission had not in fact been granted. Crawfie chose the desperate interpretation. She also, by various accounts, was being pushed by her husband George, who saw the financial opportunity and was advocating that she pursue it. The Goulds, meanwhile, had escalated. They had brought in Lady Astor, the prominent British-American political figure, as an intermediary. Lady Astor sent a copy of the eventual manuscript to the Queen for her approval in October 1949. The Queen read it. She was horrified. This is the moment that the story turns. Whatever ambiguity had existed in the early correspondence about whether Crawfie might be permitted to publish, the Queen's reaction to the actual manuscript was unambiguous. The Queen was deeply distressed, finding it shockingly frank, especially Crawford's revelations of the King's moods and the Queen's chilly relationship with Wallis Simpson. She replied to Lady Astor saying, "The governess has gone off her head," and had her private secretary send a further letter to Lady Astor. Wikipedia. The phrase is worth lingering on. The governess has gone off her head. The Queen Mother had been raised in a culture that taught women of her class to express anger through indirection. She did not say, "I am furious." She did not say, "This is a betrayal." She said with the precise dismissiveness that her vocabulary reserved for situations of complete contempt, that the governess had gone off her head. The diagnosis was not psychological, it was social. Crawfie had, by the act of producing this manuscript, demonstrated that she was no longer a person whose judgment could be relied on. She had stepped outside the category of people whose opinions about anything mattered. She had, in the language of Elizabeth's particular framework, ceased to exist as a serious presence. The Queen sent annotations on the manuscript, requesting that passages of particular concern be removed. The Goulds, by their later accounts, were taken aback by the intensity of the response. They had read the manuscript as sympathetic and complimentary, which by any reasonable assessment it was. There was nothing scandalous in it. There were no secrets revealed. The book, as Crawfie had written it, was an affectionate portrait of two children growing up in an unusual household, written by a woman who had loved them and who continued to love them. But the affection was not the point. The point was that she had written about them at all. The point was that she had treated her experience inside the household as material, as something she could shape into a narrative, sell to a magazine, publish under her own name. That was the breach. The content was secondary. The act of producing content for sale, regardless of how flattering the content might be, was itself the unforgivable thing. The Goulds did not pass the Queen's annotations along to Crawfie. They proceeded with publication. The serialized articles appeared in Ladies' Home Journal in the United States and in Woman's Own in Britain in early 1950. The book, The Little Princesses, followed shortly afterward. Both the articles and the book were published under Crawfie's name. The anonymous publication arrangement that she had originally believed was being discussed had, in the actual production process, never materialized. The royal family's response was immediate and total. Crawfie was cut off, not gradually, not through a slow withdrawal that left her some access while reducing her status, completely in a single decision communicated by silence rather than by any formal announcement. The letters she had been receiving stopped, the invitations stopped, the small markers of continued relationship, the Christmas cards, the birthday acknowledgements, the references to her in the family's communications with people she had known, stopped. Just a thing come into my mind. Tell us in the comments where you are from. Also, if you like this documentary, please consider subscribing. She was given notice to leave Nottingham Cottage, the grace and favour house in Kensington Palace Gardens that had been provided for her after her marriage. She moved out. She and George relocated to Aberdeen, where they bought a house called Burnham Hall. The house was located, by Crawfie's deliberate choice, on a road that led toward Balmoral. She had selected it specifically because the royal family would pass close to it on their annual journey to the Scottish estate where they spent every summer. The road was, in fact, the main road from Aberdeen to Balmoral. The royal family's cars passed Crawfie's house every August on the way to Scotland and every September or October on the way back. She could, from her windows, watch them go by. She could see the cars. She could see sometimes the people inside the cars, the Queen, Elizabeth, Margaret, the children who would later be born to them. They never stopped. Not once. Not in 38 years. This is the central fact of Crawfie's later life, and it is the fact that the people who knew her in those decades found hardest to look at directly. She had bought a house on the Balmoral Road. She watched the royal cars pass it for nearly 4 decades. She was the entire time, 200 yards from the road. The cars slowed to take the bend near her property. She could see the passengers. The passengers presumably could see the house. None of them ever indicated by any signal that has been recorded that they were aware of her existence. The royal family did not visit her, they did not write to her, they did not send Christmas cards, they did not, when George Boothely died in the late 1970s, send condolences. They did not, when Crawfie's own mental health began to deteriorate in her final years, make any inquiry into how she was doing. The complete cutting off that had been initiated in 1950 was maintained, with the same patient consistency that had been applied to the Wallis exile, for the rest of Crawfie's natural life. She continued to write, in the years after the original book, as her financial circumstances declined and as her husband's encouragement pushed her to capitalize on what royal connections she still had. The later writings included a column called Crawfie's Column in Woman's Own, a social diary that purported to describe royal events. The column was, in practice, written by journalists weeks in advance of the events it described. In June 1955, an issue of the column appeared describing the Trooping the Colour ceremony and the Ascot races, both of which had been cancelled that year because of a national railway strike. The column, written before the cancellations and printed without correction, described events that had not happened. The professional disgrace was complete. The British public, which had accepted the Little Princess's book as relatively harmless, treated the Woman's Own column scandal as a much more serious offence. Crawfie's reputation collapsed. The income she had been generating from her writing dried up. She and George retreated further into the Aberdeen house. The royal family, watching all of this from a distance, did nothing to intervene and nothing to offer help. The cutting off continued. George died in the late 1970s. Crawfie was alone. She had no children. Her own family, siblings and various Scottish relatives were limited and not particularly close. The friends she had made during her royal service had mostly fallen away in the years after the publication of her book. The people who continued to be associated with the royal family had understood that maintaining a relationship with Crawfie was not compatible with continued royal favour, and they had made their choices accordingly. Her mental health declined. By her late 70s she was, by the accounts of the few people who had access to her, struggling significantly. She had attempted at some point in this period to take her own life. The attempt was unsuccessful. She survived. She continued to live in the house on the Balmoral Road, watching the royal cars go by, in increasing isolation. She died on the 11th of February, 1988. She was 78 years old. She died in a nursing home in Aberdeen, having spent the last period of her life unable to manage her own affairs. There was no royal acknowledgement of her death. There was no message of condolence sent to the few people who had been close to her. There was no flower from any member of the family she had served for 16 years and the children she had raised. The Queen, who had been 6 years old when Crawfie joined the household, and who had been a young woman of 21 at her wedding to George Boothely in 1947, the woman whom Crawfie had by every available measure loved with a depth and a constancy that had defined the most important years of her adult life, sent nothing. The Queen Mother by 1988 was 87. She had outlived Crawfie by some margin and would outlive her by another 14 years. She had been, throughout the 38 years since the publication of The Little Princesses, the most consistent force behind the family's refusal to forgive. The Queen herself might have softened given time. The Queen Mother had not. The Queen Mother's preference, communicated as always through the institutional understanding of what she expected, had been that Crawfie remain outside the warmth, completely and forever, regardless of how many years passed or what circumstances she fell into. The phrase "doing a Crawfie" entered the vocabulary of British royal service. So deep was the feeling of betrayal within the royal family that for years afterward servants who spoke publicly for money were said to be doing a Crawfie. Wikipedia, the phrase was, in the household culture of the late 20th century, a warning. It told incoming staff what would happen to them if they ever attempted to do what Crawfie had done. The lifetime exile from royal favour. The cutting off so complete that even the death of the offender produced no acknowledgement. The transformation of a beloved member of the household into a non-person sustained across decades with the perfect outward composure that had been Elizabeth's signature instrument since adolescence. What had Crawfie actually done? She had written with the affection of someone who had loved her charges, a book that revealed almost nothing the public did not already know. She had named no scandals. She had violated no genuine secrets. She had, in the eyes of any reasonable assessor, simply produced a slightly indiscreet but fundamentally affectionate memoir of her time in royal service. The book was, by the standards of subsequent royal staff memoirs, almost laughably restrained. People who later read it expecting to find evidence of betrayal often came away puzzled. There was no betrayal there. There was just a Scottish woman writing fondly about two children she had loved. But the affection was not the issue. The issue was that she had stepped outside the category in which the family had placed her. She had been, in their understanding, a servant. Servants did not write books. Servants did not become public figures in their own right. Servants did not transform their experience inside the household into material for sale. The act of writing the book, regardless of its content, had told the family that Crawfie did not understand the category she belonged to, that she had begun to think of herself as a person whose experience was her own, rather than as a custodian of an experience that belonged properly to the family she had served. This was the unforgivable thing, the category violation. The presumption that her 16 years of service had given her any kind of claim on the material she had been present for. The Queen Mother in particular did not consider this presumption survivable. She decided in 1950 that Crawfie was finished. The decision held. It held for 38 years. It held past Crawfie's suicide attempt, past her widowhood, past her decline into mental illness, past her death, past her funeral, past every subsequent occasion on which a softer person might have allowed the original judgment to be revisited. It was not revisited. The door that had been closed in 1950 remained closed. Crawfie died on the wrong side of it. There is a particular detail from this story that the people who carried it out of royal service into the broader documentary record have remembered with unusual intensity. The detail concerns the house on the Balmoral Road, the choice Crawfie made to position herself within sight of the family that had cut her off, the 38 years she spent watching the royal cars drive past her windows, never stopping. The detail tells you something about her, and it tells you something about them. She had chosen to stay close. She had not, as many people in her position might have done, retreated into a different region of Britain or a different country entirely. She had stayed near them. She had wanted in some way that she could not articulate, but that the choice of house revealed, to remain in the orbit of the family she had loved. She had hoped, perhaps, that one of the cars would eventually stop, that one of the children, now adults, now married, now with children of their own, would remember her and come up the drive and knock at her door. None of them ever did. The cars drove past, year after year, decade after decade. Crawfie watched. She grew old, watching. She grew ill. She died in a nursing home in 1988, having watched the cars pass her house for the last time the previous summer, without anyone inside them giving any indication that they remembered the woman who had spent the most important years of her life raising the people they had grown into. In the next part, we turn to a different kind of cutting off, to the case of two women who were not servants but family, the Queen Mother's own nieces, the daughters of her brother John. Their fate, hidden from public view for 46 years, came out in 1987, the year before Crawfie's death. What was discovered, when the door to their existence was finally pushed open by a journalist from The Sun, told the British public something they had not known about the limits of the Queen Mother's tenderness, and about where, precisely, the line ran between the people she could include in her warmth and the people she had decided to leave permanently outside it. The story begins with a brother. The Queen Mother had 4 brothers. The one who matters here was John, called Jock by the family. He was the second son of the 14th Earl of Strathmore. He was 3 years older than Elizabeth. He was, by every available account, a pleasant and unremarkable man, the kind of younger son of a Scottish aristocratic family, who lives a comfortable, undistinguished life on the margins of the more eventful careers of his more prominent relatives. In 1914, when Elizabeth was 14, Jock married a woman named Fenella Hepburn Stuart Forbes Trefusis. She was the daughter of the 21st Baron Clinton, an aristocrat of impeccable but financially limited standing. The marriage was approved by both families. It was the kind of match that the British aristocratic system produced regularly in that period. 2 people of compatible background, joined by the social machinery of their class, expected to produce children and continue the line. They produced 5 daughters. The first, Anne, was born in 1917 and died in infancy. The second, Nerissa, was born on the 18th of February 1919. The third, Diana, was born in 1923. The fourth, Katherine, was born on the 4th of July 1926. The fifth, Patricia, followed in 1928. Of the five, two, Nerissa and Katherine, had severe developmental disabilities. The exact nature of their condition has never been definitively diagnosed in any record that has been made public. Modern observers looking at the available accounts have suggested various possibilities: a genetic condition affecting both sisters, an inherited intellectual disability, some combination of cognitive impairments that would, in modern terminology, fall somewhere on a developmental disorder spectrum. The medical language of the early 1940s, when the sisters were eventually committed to institutional care, used terms that have since been abandoned. Both sisters were classified, in the documentation of the period, as imbeciles, a clinical term then, a slur now, that referred to a particular level of intellectual functioning. They never learned to speak. By every available account, they reached a maximum mental age of approximately 6 years. This is the medical foundation of the story. It is important to be clear about it before proceeding to what was done with them. They had a real condition. They were, by the standards of any era, severely cognitively impaired. The decisions that their family made about their care were not decisions about how to manage embarrassing eccentrics. They were decisions about how to provide for two human beings who would never be able to live independently, who would require constant supervision, and who would never be able to participate in ordinary social life. In 1941, when Nerissa was 22 and Katherine was 15, their mother Fenella made the decision to commit them to institutional care. They were admitted on the same day to the Royal Earlswood Institution for Mental Defectives in Redhill, Surrey, a hospital that had previously been called the Asylum for Idiots, and which had been renamed in the 1920s in a partial concession to the changing language of disability without, at that point, much corresponding change in the actual conditions of treatment. On the same day in 1941, 3 of Fenella's nieces, the daughters of her sister Harriet, were also admitted to the same institution. The nieces, named Idenea, Etheldreda, and Rosemary Fane, had similar developmental disabilities. The 5 women, all cousins of each other, all closely related to the woman who would become Queen Mother, were placed together in the same hospital. The decision to commit them was made by the mothers, Fenella and Harriet, at a time when their husbands were absent or otherwise unable to participate in the decision. Jock, Fenella's husband, had died in 1930 of pneumonia. Henry, Harriet's husband, was preoccupied with other matters. The 2 sisters made the decision themselves. The institutionalization proceeded. This was not, in the context of 1941, an unusual decision. British aristocratic families had been institutionalizing severely disabled relatives for generations. The available alternatives, keeping the disabled person at home, with full-time care provided by the family, were not, in the framework of that period, considered preferable. Institutional care was understood as the appropriate response. The hospitals that received such patients were, by the standards of their era, professionally run and reasonably humane. The Royal Earlswood was not in 1941 a place of cruelty. It was a place of warehouse-style management of people the wider society did not know what to do with. What happened next, however, was not standard. It was in fact sufficiently unstandard that it would, when eventually revealed, produce a significant scandal. In 1963, the editors of Burke's Peerage, the authoritative reference work for British aristocratic genealogy, published an updated edition of the volume that included the Bowes-Lyon family. The entry for Jock and Fenella's daughters listed their names and dates of birth. It also listed dates of death. Nerissa was recorded as having died in 1940. Katherine was recorded as having died in 1961. Both women were alive. They were living in 1963 at the Royal Earlswood, in the same beds they had occupied since their admission in 1941. The information in Burke's Peerage was false. The publication of this false information has been the subject of considerable subsequent dispute. The official explanation offered by various members of the Bowes-Lyon family when the matter eventually came to public attention was that Fenella had been careless in completing the genealogical questionnaire that Burke's sent out to aristocratic families for their updates. In 1987, Lord Clinton, a cousin, publicly defended the family, suggesting that the incorrect information in Burke's Peerage was a simple mistake. He claimed that their mother, Fenella, was a vague person who had filled out the form incorrectly. However, given that Burke's included specific years of death, many found this explanation unconvincing. Utterly interesting. The skepticism of contemporary observers was reasonable. Burke's peerage did not invent specific years of death. The years had to come from somewhere. They had been provided to Burke's by someone in the family. The vague person explanation accounted perhaps for the providing of incorrect information. It did not account for the providing of specific incorrect dates that gave the false impression of a definite event having occurred at a definite time. What the false dates accomplished, whether deliberately or through negligence so striking that it functioned identically to deliberate deception, was the removal of Nerissa and Katherine from the world of the living. Anyone consulting Burke's peerage in 1963 or in the years following would have concluded that the Queen Mother's two profoundly disabled nieces had died, Nerissa as a young woman, Katherine in middle age. The family of the Queen Mother in this account had no living disabled members. The line that had produced the British monarch was unblemished. The genetic record in the most authoritative source for British aristocratic genealogy was clean. Whether the Queen Mother knew about the false entry in Burke's is a question that has never been definitively answered. The official line of her later defenders is that she did not. The evidence available, the closeness of the family, the consultative processes that Burke's used, the institutional intelligence networks that operated within the British aristocracy, suggests that complete ignorance is unlikely. She probably knew. She did not, by any available record, do anything to correct the entry. What the Queen Mother did do, across the 4 decades that her nieces spent at the Royal Earlswood, was substantially less than what most observers would consider the minimum required of a wealthy aunt with profoundly disabled close relatives. The nurses at the hospital, when the matter eventually came to public attention in 1987, gave clear accounts on this point. Nurses who had cared for the sisters at Earlswood stated that they had never received visits from any members of the royal or Bowes-Lyon families. There were no birthday cards, no Christmas presents, nothing to acknowledge that these women had powerful and influential relatives. Utterly interesting. The accounts were disputed by some members of the family. It was reported that their mother, Fenella, visited her daughters regularly until her own death in 1966. Lady Elizabeth Shakerley, their niece, claimed that they were not abandoned and that gifts were sent at Christmas and on their birthdays. She also stated that when the Queen Mother discovered her nieces were still alive in 1982, she made arrangements for them to receive money for treats like toys and sweets. Utterly interesting. The two accounts cannot be fully reconciled. Both probably contain some truth. Fenella probably did visit, at least in the earlier years before her own decline. Some level of family contact was probably maintained. The complete abandonment that the nurses' accounts implied was probably an exaggeration of a real but limited engagement. But the engagement, whatever its exact dimensions, did not include the Queen Mother. There is no record anywhere in the available documentation of any visit by Elizabeth to her nieces during the 4 decades of their institutional residence. There is no record of any direct correspondence. There is no record of any personal acknowledgement. The claim made by Lady Elizabeth Shakerley that the Queen Mother only discovered in 1982 that her nieces were still alive is itself a remarkable thing to claim. It either represents a defense of the Queen Mother by suggesting she had not known, or it represents an admission of how completely the existence of the nieces had been removed from her attention by the family management of the situation. If she had not known they were alive, if she had genuinely believed on the basis of the Burke's peerage entry or the family's silence on the subject that her nieces had died decades earlier, then the absence of visits and contact is explicable, but the proposed ignorance is hard to credit. Fenella, the mother of 2 of the women, lived until 1966. Fenella was the Queen Mother's sister-in-law. The 2 women would have had occasion across the years between 1941 and 1966 for some communication about family matters. The idea that Elizabeth could have lived in the same close family network as Fenella for 25 years without ever discovering that her nieces were still alive at the Royal Earlswood requires a degree of either willful blindness or unusual familial isolation that the rest of the available evidence does not support. The more probable account is that Elizabeth knew. She knew, and she had decided for reasons that combined the social conventions of her class about disability, the institutional pressures around the public image of the royal family, and her own particular framework about who deserved her attention, that the existence of her disabled nieces was something she would not be incorporating into her life. They had been placed by the family management of the situation in a category that did not require her attention. She had accepted the placement. She had, across the 4 decades, not visited. The matter came to public attention in 1987. A photographer for The Sun, the British tabloid, posed as a relative of Catherine Bowes-Lyon and gained access to the hospital. He took a photograph. The photograph showed a woman in her early 60s, thin, confused, looking directly at the camera with the expression of someone who did not understand what was happening, but who was used to not understanding what was happening. The photograph appeared on the front page of The Sun under a headline that announced the story, "Queen's Cousin Locked in Madhouse." The story that unfolded across the following days produced a substantial public scandal. The British public discovered in the space of about a week that the Queen Mother had 2 living first cousins who had been institutionalized since the 1940s, who had been falsely declared dead in Burke's peerage, and whose existence had not been acknowledged by the royal family in any visible form. Nerissa, by the time the story broke, had already died. She had passed away in 1986 at the age of 66, alone, with no family members at her funeral. Katherine was still alive at 61 and would live for another 27 years before her own death in 2014. The royal family's response to the scandal was characteristic. There was no public statement from the Queen Mother. There was no acknowledgement of the situation. The matter was managed, as such matters were always managed, through institutional silence. The family members who did speak publicly, Lord Clinton, Lady Elizabeth Shakerley, offered the explanations we have already examined. The official line was that the situation was not as it appeared, that the family had done more than the press accounts suggested, that the false entries in Burke's had been an honest mistake. The official line was not particularly persuasive. The press, having gotten hold of the story, did not let it go quickly. What was striking about the Queen Mother's response was its absence. She did not, in the months following the Sun exposé, visit Catherine. She did not, by any available record, make any public gesture of regret or care. She did not adjust the architecture of her relationship with her surviving niece in any visible way. The pattern that had been established in 1941 was maintained, with the same quiet consistency that she brought to every other long-term commitment of her life. Catherine remained at the Royal Earlswood until 1996, when the hospital closed and she was transferred to a smaller residential facility. She died in 2014 at the age of 87. Her death received only modest coverage. By that point, the Queen Mother had been dead for 12 years. The various people who had originally been responsible for the decisions about Nerissa and Catherine's care were all gone. The story had been told. The official record had absorbed it. The matter had passed into history. But the case had revealed something. It had revealed a limit. The Queen Mother, who was by every public measure warm and loving and interested in the people around her, who had, across her long life, formed bonds with countless individuals who experienced her as one of the kindest senior figures they had ever encountered, had not extended that warmth to her own profoundly disabled nieces. The line ran somewhere. The line ran at a place where the people in question could not, by reason of their condition, contribute to her social world. They could not be charmed, they could not be deployed, they could not be useful in any of the ways that the people inside her warmth were useful, so they had been placed outside it, not actively, not with cruelty in any obvious sense, simply by the absence of inclusion, by the failure to visit, by the failure to write, by the acceptance of an institutional arrangement that had been made by other family members, and that her own continued participation would have changed. This is in some ways the hardest of the cases this documentary has examined to assess fairly. The Wallis grudge had been a punishment for a specific perceived wrong. The Crawfie ostracism had been a response to a specific perceived betrayal. The treatment of Nerissa and Katherine was different. They had not done anything. They had not failed her in any way that could be identified. They had simply existed, with conditions that placed them outside the categories of people she found useful or interesting. The absence of warmth toward them was not a punishment. It was something quieter. It was a default. the default of a person whose attention was a resource she allocated according to a calculus that prioritized people who could return something. Her nieces could not return anything. The default applied. The default was sustained across 46 years, with the same patient consistency she brought to every other sustained position of her life. There is a scene in The Crown, the Netflix dramatization of the British royal family, that addresses this story. The scene presents a fictionalized version of Princess Margaret discovering the existence of her cousins and confronting the Queen Mother about why they had been hidden. The Queen Mother in the dramatization offers a defense that turns on the political logic of the monarchy. In it, the Queen Mother says, "The hereditary principle already hangs by such a precarious thread. Throw in mental illness and it's over. The idea that one family alone has the automatic birthright to the crown is already so hard to justify. The gene pool of that family had better have 100% purity." The dialogue is invented. The Queen Mother did not, by any available record, actually say these words. But the dialogue captures something about the institutional logic that probably did operate in some form in the family's handling of the situation. The disabled nieces represented a complication for the public image of the royal family. The public image of the royal family had become, in the 20th century, the principal resource the institution had for sustaining its place in British public life. The image required a certain kind of curation. The curation involved the management of which family members were visible and which were not. Nerissa and Katherine had been managed into invisibility. Whether the Queen Mother personally directed the management or merely accepted it is, as we have noted, an unsettled question. But the managed invisibility served her interests, regardless of who had originally arranged it. Her own image, the warm, loving, gloriously normal grandmother of the nation, was not complicated in the public mind by the awkward existence of two severely disabled women who shared her bloodline. The image proceeded uncomplicated. The women remained at the Royal Earlswood. The arrangement until 1987 held. In the next part we turn to a third case, a case in which the cutting off was applied to a person who was, by every measure, a member of the family in good standing, who had married into the family with all the proper sanctions, and who had then, in the Queen Mother's assessment, become someone she could not bring herself to support. The case of Diana, Princess of Wales, and the way the elderly Queen Mother, in the final years of her life, withdrew from her granddaughter-in-law with the same patient completeness that she had previously withdrawn from Crawfie and Wallis and the disabled nieces who had never received any visit. Because Diana had also failed her. Not in the way Crawfie had failed her, or Wallis had failed her, or the nieces had failed her by being born with conditions that placed them outside her social categories. Diana had failed her in a different way. Diana had married into the family that the Queen Mother had spent her life protecting, and then, in the Queen Mother's view, Diana had begun to threaten that family by her own conduct. And the Queen Mother, watching this unfold across the 1980s and 1990s, had drawn the same conclusion she had drawn about Wallis 50 years earlier. She had decided that Diana was not in the end going to be one of them. The story of Diana and the Queen Mother begins, as so many British aristocratic stories do, with a connection that predated the principals. Diana's grandmother on her mother's side was Ruth Roche, Baroness Fermoy. Lady Fermoy had been one of the Queen Mother's closest friends since the 1930s. They had met when Lady Fermoy's husband, the 4th Baron Fermoy, served as a Member of Parliament for King's Lynn, the constituency near Sandringham. The friendship that developed between the two women was deep and durable. Lady Fermoy became in 1956 one of the Queen Mother's ladies-in-waiting. She remained in that position for over 30 years. This means, among other things, that the Queen Mother had known Diana Spencer's family for decades before Diana married into the royal family. Diana had grown up at Park House, on the grounds of the Sandringham estate. She was, in the small, interconnected world of British aristocratic life, exactly the kind of girl the Queen Mother might have been expected to approve of. She came from the right family. She had the right grandmothers. Her elder sister Sarah had briefly dated Prince Charles before Diana came onto the scene. The Spencers and the Windsors were not strangers. They had been moving in adjacent circles since before Diana was born. When Charles began considering Diana as a potential bride in 1980, the Queen Mother was by every available account supportive. The match was approved within the small circle of senior royal women who effectively decided such things. The Queen herself, the Queen Mother, and Lady Fermoy in her capacity as Diana's grandmother. The three women had by various accounts actively encouraged the relationship. They had helped manage the courtship. They had been in the early stages on Diana's side. This is important to establish before proceeding to what came later. The Queen Mother did not start out hostile to Diana. She started out as someone who had known the Spencer family for decades, who had Diana's grandmother as her closest friend at court, and who had given the marriage her active institutional support. What changed her position was the marriage itself. Or rather, what changed her position was what Diana became inside the marriage. Diana had not in the early period been the version of Diana the world would later come to know. She had been a shy 19-year-old. She had curtsied properly when introduced to senior members of the family. She had observed the protocols. She had, by every account from those early months, been doing her best to fit into a world she did not entirely understand and that had not given her much guidance about how to navigate it. Andrew Morton's biography, published in 1992 with Diana's covert cooperation, captured the nature of the early period directly. In the early days, Diana was quite simply terrified of her mother-in-law. She kept the formal obsequies, dropping a deep curtsy each time they met, but otherwise kept her distance. The terror was not directed at the Queen Mother specifically. It was directed at the Queen Elizabeth II, Charles's mother, the head of state to whom Diana had to learn how to relate as both a relative and a sovereign. But Diana's strategy in the face of the institutional pressure she was experiencing applied across the senior royal women. She kept her distance. She performed the formal courtesies. She did not in the early years develop the kind of warm, intimate relationship with any of the older women that her position in the family might have suggested she should develop. The Queen Mother noticed this. She did not say so directly. She rarely said anything directly. But the people who watched her watching Diana in the early 1980s reported that she had begun very early to make her own assessment of the new Princess of Wales. The assessment was not in those first years hostile. It was something more like watchful. She was monitoring. She was waiting to see what Diana would turn into. What Diana turned into across the 1980s was a public figure of unprecedented prominence and a private woman in increasing distress. The marriage to Charles, which had been arranged with the assumption that he and Diana would settle into a conventional senior royal life together, was, almost from the beginning, in serious trouble. Charles had been in love with another woman, Camilla Parker Bowles, before the engagement. The relationship with Camilla had not ended at the marriage. Diana, discovering this in the early months of her marriage, had reacted with the combination of shock, grief, and increasing desperation that the situation produced in her. She was 19, then 20, then 21. She had been raised in the conventional expectation that marriage would be a matter of mutual fidelity. She had not been raised in the older aristocratic tradition that accepted male infidelity as a feature of marriages of state. She did not know how to absorb what was happening to her. She did not know whom to ask for help. She tried at one point to talk to the Queen about it. The conversation has been preserved in Diana's later accounts. So I went to the top lady and said, "I don't know what I should do," Diana recalled per the New York Post. She said, "I don't know what you should do," and that was it. That was help. The Queen's response was, in its way, characteristic. She did not have in her own emotional vocabulary the resources to address the situation Diana was describing. The institutional code in which she had been raised did not include the language for marital crisis between senior royals. The code held that such crises were either to be denied or to be managed privately, and the Queen had no template for the kind of direct daughter-in-law support that Diana was, in effect, asking for. Diana also tried to talk to the Queen Mother. The result, by Diana's later account, was even less satisfactory. The Queen Mother was, by the time these conversations occurred in the late 1980s, in her late 80s. She was not going to absorb Diana's marital difficulties as something requiring sympathetic engagement. She was going to do what she had always done with women whose conduct began to threaten the institutional stability of the family: observe, assess, and place into a category. The category she placed Diana in, increasingly across the late 1980s and into the 1990s, was the same category she had placed Wallis in 50 years earlier. Diana was a woman who had married into the family and was now, by her own conduct, threatening it. The threat was not identical. Wallis had threatened the family by causing the abdication. Diana was threatening it by becoming a public figure whose problems were being aired in ways that the family could not control. But the structural similarity in the Queen Mother's analysis was significant. Both women had become in different ways the kind of insider whose failure to perform the institutional role was producing damage that the family was being required to absorb. The Queen Mother's response to this assessment of Diana was the same response she gave to most assessments of this kind. She withdrew. She did not make a scene. She did not, in any direct conversation with Diana that has been recorded, accuse her of anything. She simply began, in the small ways that her senior position made available, to communicate that Diana was no longer fully inside the warmth. The most documented expression of this withdrawal involved Diana's children, William, born in 1982, and Harry, born in 1984. The Queen Mother's relationship with the boys was, in the years of their childhood, a feature of the family's life. She had them to tea at Clarence House. She took an interest in their development. She was, in the conventional way of British royal great-grandmothers, a fixture of their growing up. But the interest was not equally distributed. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the Queen Mother was treating the two boys differently in ways that became visible to those who watched the family closely. The late Queen Mother would always invite Prince William over for tea and talk to him about his future, and not invite Prince Harry. The favoritism was not subtle. William, as the elder son and the eventual heir to the throne after Charles, was the boy whose future mattered to the institution. Harry, the second son, was, in the cold institutional logic that the Queen Mother had operated by her entire life, a less consequential figure. The teas at Clarence House, the conversations about the future, the small markers of dynastic interest, these flowed toward William. Harry was included less. Harry was, in the small daily ways that children register such things, made aware that he was the lesser of the two. Diana noticed she had her own complicated feelings about the favoritism, which were intensified by the fact that she herself, as a child, had been the less favored of her parents' early children. Her father had wanted a son, and she had been the third daughter to arrive instead, before the longed-for son finally appeared in 1964. Diana understood, from her own childhood, what differential treatment of siblings did to a child. She did not want her own boys to experience what she had experienced. She decided to address the situation directly. The decision was characteristic of Diana. She did not absorb the slight in silence as many people in her position would have done. She went to the Queen Mother and confronted her about it. The confrontation has been documented by the historian Gareth Russell, who wrote the 2022 biography Do Let's Have Another Drink, The Dry Wit and Fizzy Life of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Russell's account, drawing on multiple sources within the family and the household, established that the conversation had taken place and that it had not gone well. She also apparently felt that sometimes the Queen Mother, to an extent she made obvious, preferred William to Harry, Russell wrote, until Diana confronted her about it. The conversation, by Russell's account, was the moment that turned a withdrawing relationship into an actively hostile one. Diana had stepped outside the role the Queen Mother had assigned to her. Granddaughters-in-law were not supposed to confront the senior matriarch of the family about her treatment of grandchildren. The system did not have a category for that kind of direct challenge. Diana, by issuing the challenge, had shown the Queen Mother who she was. The Queen Mother's response was the response she had been refining her entire life. She did not raise her voice. She did not issue a counter-accusation. She withdrew further. The withdrawal this time took on a harder edge. Russell's account preserves the language. Following Diana's confrontation with her grandmother-in-law, relations between the pair deteriorated even further, according to Russell, with the Queen Mother reportedly referring to Diana as a liar, and the princess retaliating by calling the aged monarch the chief leper in the leper colony. The phrases on both sides reveal something. A liar was, in the Queen Mother's vocabulary, a categorical placement. It was not a description of a specific lie that Diana had told. It was a designation of the kind of person Diana was, someone whose word was not to be trusted, whose accounts of events could be dismissed in advance, whose claims about her own experience or about the conduct of others did not require serious engagement. To call someone a liar, in the Queen Mother's framework, was to remove them from the category of people whose statements counted. It was the verbal equivalent of the door closing. The chief leper in the leper colony was Diana's response, and it told you what Diana had come to understand about the family she had married into. The phrase was theatrical, the way Diana could be theatrical in private when describing the people who had hurt her, but it captured something accurate. Diana had come to see the entire senior royal family as a group of people in some way diseased, in some way unclean, in some way damaging to those who came into contact with them. The Queen Mother in this analysis was the senior figure of the diseased group, the one most responsible for the institutional culture that had produced the situation Diana now found herself in. The two phrases, a liar and the chief leper, were not exchanged in any direct conversation. They were used about each other in private settings to people the speakers trusted. The phrases circulated in the household culture of the late 1980s and 1990s. They became known. They were eventually preserved in the documentary record, the way such phrases are eventually preserved when the people who originally used them are gone and the people who heard them feel free to report what they had heard. The phrases capture the relationship as it was by the time of Diana's death. The two women had ceased by 1996 or 1997 to maintain even the appearance of cordial relations. They saw each other at official events. They performed the minimum forms required by the family's external presentation. They did not in any meaningful way communicate. There is one more dimension to the relationship that requires attention. It concerns the parallel that the Queen Mother seems to have drawn, in her own private framework, between Diana and Wallis Simpson. The parallel was direct in the Queen Mother's mind. As noted by Express, the storied monarch saw Diana as another Mrs. Simpson, referring to the woman that her brother-in-law, Edward VIII, abdicated the throne for, a sore spot for the Queen Mother. This is a striking categorization, and it tells you something about how the Queen Mother understood the world she was living in. Diana and Wallis were, by any reasonable assessment, very different women. Wallis had been an American divorcee who had married a king and prompted his abdication. Diana had been a young English aristocrat who had married the heir to the throne and produced two sons. The circumstances were not parallel. The conduct was not parallel. The threats they posed to the institution were of different kinds and different magnitudes. But the Queen Mother, looking at the situation in the 1990s, had identified what she considered the structural similarity. Both women had been outsiders who had married into the family. Both women had then, in her assessment, become problems that the family was required to absorb. Both women had, by their own conduct or by the public attention that conduct generated, threatened the careful institutional structure that the Queen Mother had given her life to maintaining. The categorization was, in a sense, comforting to her. It allowed her to apply, to the new problem, the same template she had developed for the old one. She had handled Wallis through patient, decades-long ostracism. She would handle Diana, by the late 1990s, through the same approach. The withdrawal of warmth, the withholding of the institutional support that Diana might have benefited from, the clear communication, through behavior rather than statement, that Diana was no longer inside the family's protective embrace. The strategy was not given much time to fully develop. Diana died on the 31st of August, 1997, in a car crash in Paris. She was 36 years old. The Queen Mother was 97. The death changed everything about the public dimension of Diana's relationship with the royal family. But it did not, by any available account, change very much about the Queen Mother's private assessment of who Diana had been. The Queen Mother attended Diana's funeral. She walked with the rest of the family behind the coffin from Kensington Palace to Westminster Abbey. She performed the public role that the death of the Princess of Wales required of her, with the same composed grace she had performed every other public role of her long life. She did not, by any record that has been preserved, indicate that she had been moved by Diana's death in any way that altered her view of Diana as a person. Her granddaughter Margaret reportedly went further. Margaret had developed, across the 1990s, an even more direct hostility to Diana than the Queen Mother had displayed. By various accounts, Margaret made comments after Diana's death that suggested she saw the death itself as a kind of resolution, that the institutional problem Diana had represented had now been removed by circumstance. The Queen Mother's own private comments after Diana's death have not been preserved with the same specificity, but the people who knew her well, and who reported on her response to the public mourning that swept Britain in the days after the crash, suggested that her own emotional engagement with the situation was limited. She was 97 years old. She had buried by that point her husband, her son-in-law, her younger sister, multiple friends. She had attended the funerals of people she had known for 70 years and people she had known for 7. The funeral of Diana was for her one more in a long sequence of family events that her position required her to attend. What it was not, by any available indication, was a moment of personal grief for a granddaughter-in-law she had loved and lost. The Queen Mother did not love Diana. She had not loved Diana for years. The public rituals of mourning that the country produced in September 1997 were rituals she participated in because the institution required it. They were not, in her own internal accounting, expressions of feelings she actually had. Diana was buried at Althorpe, the Spencer family estate, on the 6th of September 1997. The Queen Mother continued for another 4.5 years to occupy her position at the head of the family. She continued to host William and Harry, both boys now, by Diana's death having grown into the senior royal grandchildren whose future she had always been most interested in. The favoritism toward William continued. The slightly cooler treatment of Harry continued. The relationship with Diana, in the Queen Mother's continuing assessment, did not need to be revised by Diana's death. A grudge that survives the death of its object is a particular kind of grudge. It tells you something about the nature of the grievance, that the grievance was never really about the person, but about the institutional offense the person had committed. Wallis had offended by causing the abdication. Diana had offended by destabilizing the family through her public conduct. The deaths of both women removed them from the field of action, but did not remove the original offense. The Queen Mother, in her continuing assessment of both women, was not assessing them as people. She was assessing them as historical actors whose actions had consequences that she, in her own continued life, was still required to manage. In the next part, we move from the women whose stories the Queen Mother's grudges have illuminated to the household itself, to the staff who watched all of this happen, to the courtiers and ladies-in-waiting who served at Clarence House across the long decades of her widowhood, who saw what she did to the people who failed her, and who carried what they saw through their own retirements and into the gradual disclosures of the years after her death, into the historical record we now have access to. Because the Queen Mother could not have maintained the architecture of her exclusions on her own, she had needed the household. The household had cooperated. And what the household members understood by the end was the precise mechanics of how a woman of her particular temperament managed, across 101 years, to be loved by a country and feared by the people who knew her best. Clarence House, where the Queen Mother lived for the 50 years of her widowhood, was a working household of considerable size. The wages bill at the end of her life ran to £1.5 million a year. The staff included a private secretary, an assistant private secretary, a treasurer, a comptroller, a chief clerk, a press secretary, an equerry, multiple ladies-in-waiting on a rotating roster, a steward, a page of the back stairs, a page of the presence, footmen, butlers, housemaids, kitchen staff, drivers, and a small army of additional positions whose titles preserved the architecture of an Edwardian aristocratic establishment that had, by the 1990s, become almost unique in surviving British public life. She kept it all running. She did not economize. She did not reduce the staff in response to financial pressure. She did not, when the costs began to require active subsidy from her daughter and her grandson, modify the scale of the operation to bring it into closer alignment with the resources actually available. She continued year by year to operate the household at the level she considered appropriate to her position. The bills accumulated. The overdraft at Coutts grew. By her death in 2002, she had left debts of approximately £7 million. The debts were paid out of her estate, which was substantial enough to absorb them. But the financial dimension of the household tells you something about her. She was, by every available account, a woman who did not really understand money in any operational sense. She had been raised in a class where the management of money was a matter for advisors. She had married into a family where the money was, for the most part, simply present. She had no working framework for the idea that her spending might need to align with her income. She spent what she spent. Other people would manage the consequences. The staff she paid out of this large and chaotically managed budget were, on the whole, well treated. This is part of the picture that needs to be acknowledged. The Queen Mother was not by any available account a difficult employer in the day-to-day sense. She did not lose her temper at her servants. She did not micromanage them. She did not subject them to the kinds of small humiliations that some figures of her class subjected their staff to. The opposite. She was in the daily operation of the household a notably warm presence. She remembered birthdays. She knew the names of the staff's children. She produced in the people who worked for her the kind of personal loyalty that long royal service can sometimes produce when the principal has the gift for it. Many of her staff stayed for decades. After she was widowed, she insisted on keeping up appearances by keeping a large staff, some of whom had been with her for years. The royal forums, the longevity of service, was a real feature of her household. People did not leave. The page of the back stairs who had been with her since the 1950s was still there in the 1990s. The various senior figures of the establishment had often joined as junior staff in their 20s and stayed until their own retirements in their 60s or 70s. This longevity is sometimes cited by her defenders as evidence that the darker accounts of her conduct must be exaggerated. The argument is that staff do not stay for 40 years with a difficult employer. The argument has some weight. People who served her closely across long careers were not on the whole traumatized by the experience. They retired with their pensions and their memories of an unusual but generally rewarding employment. But the argument also misses something. The staff who lasted were the staff who had calibrated themselves to her. They were the ones who had absorbed the household's particular culture about discretion, about emotional management, about the kinds of things that could be discussed and the kinds of things that could not. They had in effect passed through a long internal selection process that filtered for the temperaments compatible with sustained service to her. The ones whose temperaments were not compatible, the ones who could not learn the discretion, who could not absorb the emotional rules, who occasionally tried to apply some external standard to what they were observing, left sooner or later in the small invisible turnovers that any large household experiences. The ones who lasted understood the rules. The most important rule was that what happened inside the household stayed inside the household. The lesson of Crawfie, repeated quietly across decades, kept this rule in operation. Anyone who entered the Queen Mother's service in the second half of the 20th century arrived knowing what had happened to the governess who had written the book. The Crawfie name had become, in the household's internal vocabulary, a warning. Doing a Crawfie was the worst thing a member of staff could do. It guaranteed lifetime exile. It guaranteed, in the small institutional ways the household made available, that the rest of your life would be spent on the wrong side of a door that would never open again. This was not abstract. The Crawfie example was visible. The royal family's annual journeys past Crawfie's house in Aberdeen were known within the household. The complete cutting off was known. The funeral that had passed without acknowledgement in 1988 was known. The staff understood, looking at the Crawfie case, exactly what would happen to them if they ever attempted to convert their experience inside the household into a public account. They would be finished. The Queen Mother would never speak to them again. The rest of the family would follow her lead. The professional consequences in their own subsequent lives would be substantial and permanent. So they did not write books. They did not give interviews. They did not, while she was alive, allow themselves to be the source for any of the various biographical projects that journalists periodically attempted. The discretion was complete. The household maintained, across the 50 years of her widowhood, the kind of professional silence that very few institutions in modern public life are able to maintain. What the discretion preserved, specifically, was her image. The image of the warm Queen Mum, the gloriously normal grandmother, the woman whose only visible flaws were a fondness for gin and a love of horses. The image survived intact. decade after decade, because the people who knew otherwise had decided, for reasons that combined personal loyalty, professional self-interest, and the genuine difficulty of speaking against a figure of her institutional weight, that they would not be the ones to disturb it. There was one figure inside this system whose position was particularly complicated and whose case deserves direct examination. Ruth Roche, Lady Fermoy, the woman who had been the Queen Mother's lady-in-waiting since 1956, and who was also the maternal grandmother of Diana, Princess of Wales. Lady Fermoy occupied in the small interconnected world of the senior royal household and the Spencer family a position with no real precedent. She was Diana's grandmother. She had known Diana since birth. She was, in any conventional accounting of family loyalties, a person whose primary obligation should have been to her granddaughter, but she had also been for 30 years before Diana's marriage, the closest companion of the Queen Mother. The two women, Lady Fermoy and the Queen Mother, were genuine friends. They saw each other almost daily. They had built across decades the kind of senior female friendship that was the principal personal relationship of both their later lives. When Diana married Charles in 1981, Lady Fermoy's position became in effect untenable. She was being asked to be both the Queen Mother's confidant and the Princess of Wales's grandmother, to balance two loyalties that, as the marriage deteriorated across the 1980s, became increasingly impossible to balance. The Queen Mother's view of Diana was, as we have examined, hardening. Diana's view of the senior royal women, including her own grandmother, was hardening in parallel. Lady Fermoy made her choice. She chose the Queen Mother. The choice was not announced. It did not require any formal declaration. It was simply expressed, year by year, in the small daily decisions that revealed where her primary loyalty lay. She continued to serve at Clarence House. She continued to spend her days with the Queen Mother. She did not, when Diana came to her seeking sympathy or advice about the marriage, become the advocate her granddaughter needed. She maintained, with a coldness that Diana herself eventually came to understand and resent, the institutional position of the senior royal household over the personal claim of her own granddaughter. Diana noticed. She had grown up regarding Lady Fermoy with the kind of conventional respect that aristocratic granddaughters were supposed to give their senior grandmothers. By the late 1980s, the respect had eroded into something more bitter. Diana's grandmother Ruth, Lady Fermoy, had been one of the Queen Mother's ladies-in-waiting since 1956, and initially, Diana seems to have blamed her for turning the Queen Mother against her. The blame was, in some measure, accurate. Lady Fermoy had not actively turned the Queen Mother against Diana. The Queen Mother had been entirely capable of forming her own assessment of her granddaughter-in-law, but Lady Fermoy had not at any point used her position of intimate access to the Queen Mother to advocate for Diana. She had not been Diana's voice inside Clarence House. She had been instead the Queen Mother's voice when she returned home from Clarence House to her own family. The institutional perspective brought back into the Spencer family, applied to its own daughter, with the authority of a senior aristocratic woman whose loyalty had been claimed by the older institution. Lady Fermoy died in 1993, 4 years before her granddaughter. Diana attended the funeral. By the accounts of those who saw her there, the attendance was a duty performed without warmth. The grandmother who had chosen the Queen Mother over her own granddaughter had, in Diana's understanding, earned the cool detachment of the duty performance. There was no genuine grief on Diana's part, or at least no grief that anyone witnessed. The case of Lady Fermoy is the clearest example of what the Queen Mother's institutional position could do to the personal lives of the people who served her. Lady Fermoy had not by any conventional standard been forced into the choice she made. She had made it freely. But the structure of her relationship with the Queen Mother, the 30 years of close friendship, the daily intimacy, the shared identity as senior figures of the same institutional world, had in practice made the choice almost automatic. She had become, across the long decades of her service, a person whose primary self was the senior court figure rather than the Spencer matriarch. The court figure, faced with a conflict, chose the court. There were other ladies-in-waiting whose service was less complicated than Lady Fermoy's, but whose collective experience tells you something about the household. The ladies who served the Queen Mother across her widowhood were, by the standards of British aristocratic women of their generation, a remarkable collection. They were intelligent, well-read, often accomplished in their own private domains. They were not in any sense decorative figures. They were companions, advisors, organizers, and the maintainers of the daily social rhythm that the household required. What they shared was the temperament for the work. They had, almost without exception, learned the discretion that the household required. They had learned also a particular emotional skill, the ability to move freely between intimacy with the Queen Mother and the absolute professional reserve that any service to a senior royal demands. The skill was difficult. Most people could not do it. The ones who could develop, across years of practice, the kind of internal compartmentalization that allowed them to know things about her without ever, in any setting, speaking the things they knew. The compartmentalization extended to their own private lives. Many of these women had husbands and children. They had presumably told their husbands certain things about their work. The discretion that operated inside the household must have had some flexibility around the private domestic conversations of the women who staffed it. But the husbands, by every available record, kept their own counsel. The women's private disclosures, whatever they had been, did not leak. The British press of the 1970s and 1980s, which was perfectly capable of obtaining and publishing damaging royal gossip when it could, did not on the whole get the kind of accounts of the Queen Mother that her household members could have provided. The system of discretion extending out from the household into the private lives of the women who served it held. The system held because the alternative was unthinkable. The women who served the Queen Mother across the long decades of her widowhood understood with the same clarity as their colleagues had understood it what would happen to anyone who broke the discretion. The Crawfie example was always there. It was always visible. Anyone tempted by the kinds of memoir writing or interview giving that might have been professionally rewarding had, for reference, the precise outcome of the last person who had tried it. They would never speak to her again. They would never speak to any of her family again. They would spend the rest of their lives outside the warmth, watching the cars drive past, the way Crawfie had watched the cars drive past. So they did not break the discretion the household held. There is one further dimension of the household's operation that deserves attention. It concerns the small daily atmosphere of life at Clarence House, the texture of the Queen Mother's emotional weather, day by day, year by year, as her staff experienced it. She was on the whole cheerful. This is documented across multiple accounts. The cheerfulness was not performed for her staff. It was the actual weather of her daily life, maintained with the same disciplined consistency that she maintained everything else. She rose late, in the late mornings. She had a gin and Dubonnet before lunch. She received her ladies-in-waiting and her senior staff with the easy social manner that was her great gift. She ate well. She drank consistently throughout the day, gin and Dubonnet, then wine with lunch, then martinis before dinner, then champagne with dinner, at levels that would have produced significant impairment in a person who had not, like her, developed a substantial tolerance across decades of practice. She watched racing on television. She placed bets, modest ones, on the horses she was interested in. She read newspapers, she wrote letters, she enjoyed with apparent genuineness the small daily routines of an Edwardian-style domestic life that her position allowed her to maintain into the early 21st century. Inside this cheerful daily atmosphere, the grudges operated. They did not produce a sour mood. They did not in any visible way distort the household's daily functioning. They lived alongside the cheerfulness, in the parallel internal track that the Queen Mother had been operating since her wartime adolescence. She could be simultaneously the most pleasant company in the room and the silent maintainer of a 50-year refusal to forgive a sister-in-law who had died 15 years earlier. The two states did not contradict each other in her own internal experience. They were, by the time she had reached her 90s, simply features of who she was. The staff understood this in the way that staff understand the principles they serve over long periods. They knew the cheerfulness was real. They knew the grudges were also real. They had calibrated themselves to operate inside a household where both were present, and where the maintenance of both was, in some way, the actual job they were performing. Their function was to support her cheerful daily life. It was also in the small institutional ways their positions made available to support the architectures of exclusion that the cheerful daily life rested on top of. They sent the Christmas cards she wanted sent. They did not send the ones she did not want sent. They received the visitors she wanted received. They turned away the ones she did not want received, with the kind of professional gentleness that left the rejected visitors uncertain about whether they had actually been rejected or simply caught the household at a bad moment. They maintained the architecture without any visible architecture being constructed. The Queen Mother's preferences were the architecture. The staff's daily work was the construction. By the end of her life, the system had been operating for so long that very few of the people involved in it remembered any other way of working. The discretion had become absolute. The internal vocabulary of the household, doing a Crawfie, the various code phrases for the people who had been placed outside the warmth, the small linguistic markers that distinguished people inside from people outside, had become a fully developed dialect. New staff arriving at Clarence House in the 1990s had to learn the dialect from scratch. They learned it, not always quickly, not always completely, but well enough to function. The household survived her death. Most of the long-serving members of it retired in 2002, or shortly afterward, as Clarence House transferred to the use of Prince Charles, who was inheriting the residence as part of the institutional reorganization that her death required. The retirement scattered the senior figures of her establishment back into private life. They went home. They settled into the years that remained to them. They began slowly and selectively to allow themselves to be sources for the histories that their own service had made possible. The disclosures came in fragments, a line in one biography, a specific anecdote in another. The cumulative picture that has built up across the 23 years since her death is the picture this documentary has been drawing on. It is incomplete. There are still things her household members carried into their private retirements that they have not yet allowed to be recorded. Some of them will die without ever speaking the things they witnessed. Some of them have already died. The full record will never exist. But what does exist is enough to understand that the cheerful Queen Mum the country had loved was, in her domestic life, a more complicated figure than the public version had ever revealed. Enough to see the architectures of exclusion that her household had maintained for her. Enough to recognize, in the long tradition of disciplined staff service that her establishment represented, the particular kind of professional work that had been required to keep the architectures invisible across her 101 years. In the final part, we look at what she left behind. The funeral, the estate, the 17 months between her death and her daughter's mourning, the way the public version of her was preserved, even after she was gone, through the long British attachment to the figure she had constructed across her lifetime, and the way the private version, the petty, punishing, perfectly composed woman the staff had served, has been gradually allowed, in the years since 2002, to take its place beside the public version in the historical record. Both versions are the same woman. This documentary has been about how that was possible. The final part will be about what it cost, and what it preserved, and what the long arc of her life finally meant for the people who had spent any part of their own lives close to her. She died on the 30th of March 2002 at Royal Lodge, Windsor. She was 101 years old. The cause of death was given as old age, with complications from a chest infection she had been managing for the previous several weeks. Her younger daughter, Princess Margaret, had died 7 weeks earlier, on the 9th of February. The Queen Mother had attended Margaret's funeral in a wheelchair. By every account from those present at Royal Lodge in the final weeks, the loss of Margaret accelerated her own decline. She had outlived her husband by 50 years. She had outlived her younger daughter by less than 2 months. She would be buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor beside Bertie on the 9th of April. The funeral was, by every reasonable measure, the largest royal occasion of its decade. More than 200,000 people filed past her coffin during the lying-in state at Westminster Hall. The queue stretched at times for over a mile. The British public produced in the days between her death and her burial the kind of spontaneous national mourning that had been seen perhaps 3 times in the previous century at the deaths of George V, of George VI, and of Diana. The mourning was genuine. The country had loved her. The figure she had constructed across her lifetime, the warm Queen Mum, the gallant widow, the cheerful presence at every national occasion of the previous 50 years, had earned by the metrics of public sentiment the response her death produced. The Queen, her daughter Elizabeth II, read a brief televised tribute the day before the funeral. The tribute was personal. It was by the Queen's standards of public emotional disclosure, unusually direct. She spoke of her mother's infectious zest for living, of the love and laughter she had brought into the lives of those around her. The tribute was sincere. The Queen had, by every available account, loved her mother deeply and continuously across the 76 years of their relationship. The grief expressed in the tribute was not performed. The tribute did not mention any of the people whose stories this documentary has been examining. It did not mention Wallis. It did not mention Crawfie. It did not mention Nerissa or Katherine. It did not mention Diana, whose death 5 years earlier had produced a national mourning of comparable scale, and whose own complicated relationship with the Queen Mother had been part of the texture of the previous decade's family history. These omissions were not surprising. The tribute was not the place for that kind of accounting. The tribute was the place for the public version of the relationship, expressed in the public register that the occasion required. The other people, the other relationships, the other parts of her mother's long life that did not fit the tribute's frame, those remained where they had always been, in the private archive that the institutional version of the family kept separate from the public one. The estate was settled across the months that followed. The total value, after the £7 million in debts had been cleared, was estimated at somewhere between £50 million and £70 million. The bulk of the estate passed to the Queen, her sole surviving daughter. There were various specific bequests, to staff who had served long careers, to godchildren, to charitable organisations she had supported. The Castle of May, the property in Caithness she had bought in 1952 and restored across the decades, was transferred to a trust for the benefit of the local community. Her racing horses were distributed among the family members who would continue their careers. Her jewellery, most of which had originated in the collection of Mrs. Greville, the wealthy society hostess who had left it to her in 1942, returned to the royal collection from which it had come. The Grace and Favour residences were reassigned. Clarence House, which she had lived in since 1953, transferred to the Prince of Wales, who undertook substantial renovations before moving in. Royal Lodge, where she had died, eventually went to Prince Andrew, who would later live there during the long decline of his own public life. The Castle of May was preserved, in the Trust's hands, as a kind of memorial site, open to the public during certain summer months, maintained as the Queen Mother had maintained it. The institutional infrastructure she had built across her widowhood was, in the months and years after her death, gradually dismantled or absorbed into other parts of the family's establishment. The senior staff who had served her at Clarence House mostly retired, with their pensions and the various honours that long royal service earned. The ladies-in-waiting returned to their private lives. The household that had run at full capacity for the 50 years of her widowhood was wound down across 2002 and 2003. What remained in the immediate aftermath of her death was the public memory. The figure of the Queen Mum entered, almost immediately, into the kind of secular sainthood that the British public reserved for a small handful of national figures who had captured something specific in the public imagination. She was remembered as the woman who had refused to leave London during the Blitz, as the woman who had stood beside her stammering husband during the wartime broadcasts, as the woman who had charmed several generations of foreign dignitaries and ordinary Britons with the same deployed warmth, as the woman whose 100th birthday in 2000 had occasioned a national parade that the country had attended in its millions. This figure was real. The events that constituted it had actually happened. She had been there during the Blitz. She had stood beside Bertie. She had charmed the ambassadors and the children and the people pressed against the barriers. The public memory was not a fabrication. It was an accurate record of one set of facts about her. The other set of facts, the ones this documentary has been examining, was also real. They had also happened. Wallis had spent 50 years in exile. Crawfie had spent 38 years watching the cars pass her house in Aberdeen. Nerissa and Katherine had spent their lives at the Royal Earlswood. Diana had been called a liar, and had called the Queen Mother the chief leper in the leper colony. and had died at 36 with the relationship unrepaired. Both sets of facts were the same woman. This is the difficulty that any honest accounting has to hold. She was the warm public figure. She was also the patient maintainer of 50-year exclusions. The warmth and the exclusions were not contradictory. They were, in her own integrated experience, two expressions of the same underlying disposition, the disposition of a woman who had decided very early in life that she would allocate her warmth selectively, that the allocation was hers to make, and that the people on the wrong side of the allocation would receive whatever the allocation had withdrawn. The public got the warmth. The public was charmed. The public did not, on the whole, ever encounter the other side, because the other side was not directed at the public. It was directed at specific individuals whose conduct or position or simple existence had placed them outside the categories she was willing to extend warmth to. The institutional system around her, the courtiers, the ladies-in-waiting, the press secretaries, the British media establishment that had decided across decades to treat her with a particular kind of protective indulgence, had ensured that the directed nature of her exclusions was not visible to the people they were not directed at. This is one way of describing what she had built. She had built, across 101 years, a public reputation that depended on the maintenance of a complete separation between two parts of her conduct. The public part was the part the country knew. The private part was the part the staff knew. The staff did not speak. The country did not on the whole ask. The separation held. After her death, the separation began, slowly, to be eroded. Not by any single dramatic disclosure, but by the gradual accumulation of fragments that the various people who had known her allowed themselves to release. A sentence in a memoir, a line in an interview, the publication of a previously suppressed letter, the willingness in some of the more recent royal biographies to mention specific incidents that earlier biographers had been too cautious to mention. William Shawcross's official biography, published in 2009, was the most sustained attempt to provide an authorized version of her life. The biography was, by any reasonable assessment, a thorough and serious piece of work. Shawcross had been given access to her papers. He had interviewed many of the people who had served her. He had produced a 900-page account that aimed at completeness within the limits of an authorized project. The limits showed. The biography acknowledged some of the difficult material. The Wallis grudge in particular was treated with reasonable directness, but it minimized other parts. The Crawfie episode was covered briefly, with the family's interpretation of the events given more weight than Crawfie's own. The hidden cousins received only passing attention. The complicated relationship with Diana was handled with the tact appropriate to a project authorized by the family and published while the principal figures were still alive. Subsequent biographies have filled in the gaps. Gareth Russell's 2022 book, Let's Have Another Drink, was the most direct of these, a biography that took the dry wit and the warm public manner as its starting point and then worked outward to the harder material. Russell drew on sources that Shawcross either had not had access to or had chosen not to use. The book preserved, among other things, the Diana confrontation and the liar and leper exchanges. It was a book that took the two sides of her seriously and tried to hold them together. Other accounts have followed. The disclosures continue to accumulate. The full picture is not yet available, and it may never be available. Some of the staff who served her closely have died without speaking. Some of the documents that would clarify specific incidents are sealed in archives that will not open for decades. The history is still being written. What has emerged so far is enough, however, to allow the more complicated picture to take its place beside the simpler public one. The Queen Mum the country loved is still there. The petty, punishing, perfectly composed woman the staff served is also there. Both versions exist in the gradually accumulating historical record as accounts of the same person. The staff who carried the second version into their retirements have, on the whole, treated it with a particular kind of respect. They have not, as Crawfie did, attempted to monetize their service through aggressive public disclosures. They have not, as some retired royal staff have done in other periods, sold their stories to newspapers. They have allowed the disclosures to occur slowly, through carefully chosen biographical projects, in ways that have respected the institutional culture they served while also, gradually, completing the historical record. This restraint has its own significance. The staff who served the Queen Mother across her widowhood were, by the standards of any similar institution, extraordinarily disciplined. Their continued discretion in retirement, their willingness to release the harder material only in measured doses across decades, has preserved something of the character of the household they served. They did not in the end do a Crawfie. They did not break the discretion. They simply, slowly, allowed the discretion to relax in ways that the institution itself, by the time of their disclosures, was no longer in a position to prevent. There is a question this documentary has been circling for 8 parts, and it deserves a direct answer before we close. The question is whether the petty, punishing version of her cancels out the warm, beloved version. Whether the existence of the grudges and the ostracisms and the cold institutional refusals to forgive means that the public love she received was unearned, that the figure who was mourned by hundreds of thousands of Britons was a figure they did not really know. The answer is no. The public love was earned. The warmth she extended to the country across her long life was real. The hundreds of thousands of small encounters in which ordinary Britons met her and came away feeling they had been seen, those encounters happened. The people who had them are not wrong to remember her with affection. The country is not wrong to have mourned her. What the country did not know was that the same capacity for warmth, the same gift for making people feel seen, was a resource she allocated. The allocation was deliberate. The people who fell outside the allocation were not, on the whole, randomly chosen. They were chosen because they had failed her in ways she had decided were not subject to forgiveness. The choices reveal something about her. They reveal a woman whose framework of relationship operated on principles that most people would consider unusually rigid, once-and-for-all judgments, applied without subsequent revision, maintained across whatever years of life remained to enforce them. This rigidity is in some sense what made the warmth so effective. The same disciplined consistency that produced the lifelong grudges also produced the unwavering public manner. She did not have, like most people, a temperament that fluctuated with mood. She had decided what she was going to be in public, and she was that thing without exception across every public occasion of 75 years. The same internal architecture that maintained the cheerfulness also maintained the exclusions. They were, in her, expressions of the same underlying capacity. The capacity is real. It is also, when viewed from inside the lives of the people on the wrong side of her exclusions, frightening. Wallis lived for 50 years on the wrong side of it. Crawfie lived for 38. Nerissa and Katherine lived their entire institutional lives without receiving a single visit. Diana died at 36, having been categorized in her final years as a liar. The people on the right side of the exclusions had a different experience. The Queen, whom she had loved with a constancy that did not waver, lived inside her warmth from infancy until her death. Margaret similarly. Charles, the favored grandson, the various godchildren, the long-serving staff members, the friends of decades who had never given her cause to reconsider her favor. These people experienced her as one of the warmest and most generous senior figures of their lives. Their accounts are also accurate. They were also, in their way, telling the truth about her. Both accounts are the truth. They are the truth about different sides of the same person. The woman who had made the original decision in adolescence that warmth would be controlled, that the control would be hers, that the people who failed to deserve the warmth would receive the precise inverse of it for as long as she had any power to direct what they received, and had then enforced that decision with the steady, patient, perfectly composed consistency that defined her across every other dimension of her life. She lived for 101 years. She enforced the decision for nearly all of them. The people who died with her warmth still extended to them died grateful. The people who died on the other side died, in most cases, unforgiven. The country loved the version it knew. The country was right to love that version. The country did not, on the whole, know the other version, because the other version was directed at specific individuals and was not, by design, available for public observation. This documentary has been about the other version. It has been about Wallis and Crawfie and Nerissa and Katherine and Diana and the staff who watched the architecture being maintained and the system of discretion that kept the architecture invisible. It has been about the part of her that the public love did not, in most cases, ever encounter. It has not been about cancelling the public love. It has been about completing the picture. The Queen Mum the country mourned in 2002 was real. The petty, punishing, perfectly composed woman her ladies-in-waiting never spoke about while she was alive was also real. She was both. The bothness is the thing the historical record now holds. What the staff who served her carried out of their long careers was the bothness in its complete form. They had seen the warmth in operation. They had seen the exclusions in operation. They had understood by the end that the same person produced both, with the same instruments, on the same days, often within the same hour. They had spent their working lives inside the production. They had, by the time they retired, developed a relationship with what they had witnessed that was complicated enough to require, in many cases, the full remaining decades of their lives to fully process. Some of them have processed it by writing about it, carefully, in the limited disclosures they have allowed themselves. Some have processed it by speaking to biographers, on conditions of varying confidentiality, that have permitted certain stories to be told and certain others to be reserved. Some have processed it, simply, by remembering, by holding the memory of what they witnessed in the private spaces of their own old age, where the memory is not subject to any disclosure obligation, and where it will eventually pass with them. This is the inheritance of long royal service. The memory carried, often through decades, by the people who watched what could not at the time be spoken about. The Queen Mother had built the architecture, the staff had maintained it, the architecture had survived her. The staff, in the years since her death, have allowed the survival to be partial, to acknowledge enough of what they witnessed that the historical record can hold the more complete version. She had lived 101 years. She had served, by her own estimation, the institution of the British monarchy for almost all of them. The institution had in turn served her by maintaining the public version of her across the decades when the private version was operating in parallel. By 2002, when she died, the institution itself was changing. The discretion that had protected her would not protect her successors with the same completeness. The press culture had changed. The deference of the post-war period had eroded. The senior royal figures who came after her, Charles, William, the family that would inherit the throne in the years after her daughter's eventual death, would not be able to count on the institutional silence that had surrounded her own private conduct. She was the last figure of her kind, the last royal personality whose public version and private version could be sustained across more than 7 decades in the kind of complete separation that her household had maintained. The protection she received from the institutional culture of her time was, by the time of her death, no longer reproducible. This is perhaps the final thing to be said about her. She was a product of a particular system at a particular moment in its operation. The system permitted her to be the woman she was, both the public version and the private version, without the two ever colliding in any way the country was forced to confront. The system has in the years since modified itself. Future royal figures will not have access to the same protection. What she did with the protection she had was build the most consistent and most durable public personality of any senior royal of her century. The public personality earned the country's love. The country gave the love. The exchange was not in the end dishonest, it was simply incomplete. The completion has been left to the historical record, which is now slowly assembling. This documentary has been one contribution to the assembly. Others will follow. The full picture will continue to develop, year by year, as the staff who served her allow more of what they witnessed to enter the public record. The full picture, when it is finally complete, will show what this documentary has tried to show. A woman who was, simultaneously and across every year of her long life, both the warmest figure of the British monarchy in modern times and one of its most patient, most unforgiving, and most perfectly composed administrators of long-term punishment. She was both. She was always both. The country loved one of her. The staff served both of her. The history will remember both of her. That is what she was. That is the story her ladies-in-waiting never spoke about while she was alive. That is what they have, gradually, been allowing the rest of us to know. Some of them have processed it by writing about it, carefully in the limited disclosures they have allowed themselves. Some have processed it by speaking to biographers, on conditions of varying confidentiality, that have permitted certain stories to be told and certain others to be reserved. Some have processed it simply by remembering, by holding the memory of what they witnessed in the private spaces of their own old age, where the memory is not subject to any disclosure obligation, and where it will eventually pass with them. This is the inheritance of long royal service. The memory carried, often through decades by the people who watched what could not at the time be spoken about. The Queen Mother had built the architecture, the staff had maintained it, the architecture had survived her. The staff, in the years since her death, have allowed the survival to be partial, to acknowledge enough of what they witnessed, that the historical record can hold the more complete version. She had lived 101 years. She had served, by her own estimation, the institution of the British monarchy for almost all of them. The institution had, in turn, served her by maintaining the public version of her across the decades when the private version was operating in parallel. By 2002, when she died, the institution itself was changing. The discretion that had protected her would not protect her successors with the same completeness. The press culture had changed. The deference of the post-war period had eroded. The senior royal figures who came after her, Charles, William, the family that would inherit the throne in the years after her daughter's eventual death, would not be able to count on the institutional silence that had surrounded her own private conduct. She was the last figure of her kind, the last royal personality whose public version and private version could be sustained across more than 7 decades in the kind of complete separation that her household had maintained. The protection she received from the institutional culture of her time was, by the time of her death, no longer reproducible. This is perhaps the final thing to be said about her. She was a product of a particular system at a particular moment in its operation. The system permitted her to be the woman she was, both the public version and the private version, without the two ever colliding in any way the country was forced to confront. The system has, in the years since, modified itself. Future royal figures will not have access to the same protection. What she did with the protection she had was build the most consistent and most durable public personality of any senior royal of her century. The public personality earned the country's love. The country gave the love. The exchange was not in the end dishonest. It was simply incomplete. The completion has been left to the historical record, which is now slowly assembling. This documentary has been one contribution to the assembly. Others will follow. The full picture will continue to develop year by year as the staff who served her allow more of what they witnessed to enter the public record. The full picture, when it is finally complete, will show what this documentary has tried to show. A woman who was, simultaneously and across every year of her long life, both the warmest figure of the British monarchy in modern times and one of its most patient, most unforgiving and most perfectly composed administrators of long-term punishment. She was both. She was always both. The country loved one of her. The staff served both of her. The history will remember both of her. That is what she was. That is the story her ladies-in-waiting never spoke about while she was alive. That is what they have, gradually, been allowing the rest of us to know. The architecture this documentary has been describing was, in almost every case, applied to people the Queen Mother had decided to remove from her life. Wallis, Crawfie, the hidden cousins, Diana. Each of these cases involved a person the Queen Mother had categorized as outside her warmth, and each was managed with the same patient consistency that defined her approach to such removals. There was one case, however, that did not fit this pattern. There was one person whose place inside the Queen Mother's warmth was secure, who never lost it, who could not have lost it, whose presence at the center of the Queen Mother's emotional life was as foundational as her presence at the center of the Queen Mother's daily routines. That person was her younger daughter, Princess Margaret. The Queen Mother loved Margaret. There is no available record that suggests otherwise. Across the 72 years between Margaret's birth in 1930 and her death in February 2002, the relationship between mother and younger daughter was, by every account from those who observed it, the closest and most affectionate of the Queen Mother's family relationships. Margaret had been the indulged child, the witty one, the one whose particular charm and vulnerability had drawn from her mother a kind of attention that Elizabeth, the older daughter, the future queen, the one trained from earliest childhood for the role she would occupy, had not always received. This is the case that complicates the picture, the case that has to be held alongside the other cases, because together they reveal something that none of the cases on its own could reveal. They reveal what the Queen Mother could do and what she could not do. They reveal where the architecture of patient management could be applied successfully, and where it failed. It failed in the end with Margaret. It failed in the most consequential possible way. The Queen Mother had been able to manage, across decades, the lives of every other person who had become a problem in her vicinity. She had not been able to manage the slow disintegration of her younger daughter's life. She had watched it happen. She had, in the small private ways available to her as a mother, tried to intervene. The interventions had not worked. Margaret had declined, across the second half of her life, into the kind of late-stage personal collapse that the Queen Mother's particular gifts could not arrest. And the most painful part of the story, the part that the Queen Mother carried privately for the last 5 decades of her life, was that she had been responsible, partially but really, for the decision that had set the decline in motion. Begin with the relationship that produced the crisis. Peter Townsend joined the royal household in 1944, when Margaret was 13. He had been a celebrated wartime fighter pilot, awarded the Distinguished Service Order and the Distinguished Flying Cross during the Battle of Britain. He was 29 when he arrived at Buckingham Palace as an equerry to King George VI. He was tall, handsome, married, with 2 young sons. He was, by every account, exactly the kind of man the post-war British establishment was producing in some quantity: modest, capable, decorated, loyal to the institution that had hired him. He served the king for the rest of George VI's life. The relationship between the king and Townsend deepened across the years. The king liked him personally. He came to be regarded within the household as one of the trusted senior staff whose presence at the family's holidays and informal gatherings was unremarkable. Margaret saw him, across her late adolescence and early 20s, in the kind of close ongoing proximity that royal household service produced. She watched him manage her father's complicated wartime and post-war duties. She watched him return, evening after evening, to a marriage that was, as the family had begun to understand by the late 1940s, not happy. When George VI died in February 1952, Margaret was 21. She was devastated. Her father had been the central figure of her emotional life, the parent who had by every account particularly delighted in her. The grief was extreme. She was prescribed sedatives. She attended church in the months that followed, sometimes twice a day. Her older sister had become queen, and was now occupied with the immense practical demands of the new reign. Her mother was managing her own widowhood. Margaret was, in the period immediately after her father's death, alone in a way she had not previously been alone in her life. Townsend was there. He had been promoted after the king's death to the position of comptroller of the Queen Mother's household, the senior administrative figure of the establishment that was being constructed to support the new widow. He was, by virtue of his position, present at Clarence House daily. He was, by virtue of his recent divorce, finalized in late 1952, newly available in a way he had not previously been. Margaret was 22. She had grown up watching this man. She knew him well. The grief and the proximity and the available emotional space combined, across the months of late 1952 and early 1953, into a relationship that began quietly and without immediate scandal, somewhere inside Clarence House. Thanks for watching the full documentary. If you like this type of documentary, then please stay with us by subscribing to our channel.